Chapter 1. The Burrow of Ambition. The air in the warren was thick with the pungent stench of mildew, blood, and something worse, the coppery tang of fresh death. The tunnels of Clan Vilefang echoed with the sounds of Skaven chatter, a nervous, chittering cacophony that reverberated off the damp stone walls. At the center of the sprawling burrow, atop a crude dais made of jagged warped iron and scavenged wood, lay the mangled remains of the former Warlord Skratt Tongue. His throat was torn open, a ragged mess of pink sinew and blackened fur, his body twisted in a final agonized spasm. His once proud warpstone-inlaid armor was now a shattered ruin, his warblade clutched in stiff, clawed fingers. Standing over him, Warlord Skratt Spinescourge exhaled heavily, his breath rattling with satisfaction. His fur was matted with the blood of his predecessor, dark rivulets running down the rusted steel of his breastplate, dripping from the serrated edges of his twin blades. One final twitch of Skurik's corpse confirmed it. He was dead. Scrat threw his head back and let out a shrill, triumphant screech, baring his yellowed fangs. "Clan Vilefang is mine now," he spat, his voice a guttural snarl as he brandished his gore-drenched blades for all to see. "Obey, serve, or die like weak scum, Venom Tongue." A moment of silence. Then the assembled Skaven in the great chamber let out a chorus of terrified hisses and frantic nods, some scurrying forward to prostrate themselves before their new master. Others, slower to act, received swift encouragement, a jagged blade drawn across a throat or a rusted spear shoved through a gut. Those who hesitated learned quickly that Scrat would tolerate no delay. The warlord's beady red eyes scanned the chamber. The highest-ranking members of the clan stood gathered, their tails twitching with nervous energy. Among them was the bloated packmaster Krizik, who ruled over the breeding pits and handled Vilefang's mutated rat-ogres. Next to him, Warlock engineer Vretch Gnawbolt, his whiskers twitching as he subtly adjusted the crackling warp energy capacitor strapped to his back. Others were mere lesser chieftains, their armor cobbled together from scavenged steel, their loyalty as thin as the rusted blades they wielded. Scrat knew them all for what they were: schemers, plotters, cowards. He had to make his dominance clear, had to drive home the lesson that he would not be undermined like Skurik had been. With a quick gesture, he pointed at one of the lesser chieftains, a particularly nervous-looking rat named Skratt Spinecrawler. The moment Skrit realized he'd been singled out, his entire body tensed, his tail curling defensively around his feet. Yes, great warlord. Skrit is loyal, swears it." Scrat clicked his fangs together, feigning thoughtfulness. Then in one swift motion, he hurled a jagged throwing knife. The blade buried itself deep in Skrit's throat with a sickening crunch, blood bubbling from the wound as the unfortunate Skaven clawed at his ruined windpipe. He fell to his knees, making a pitiful gurgling sound before collapsing face first into the muck. The room fell deathly silent. Scrat sneered, stepping forward and planting one clawed foot on the still-twitching corpse. "Loyalty is not begged for, it is proven. Skratt Spinecrawler was weak, too slow to bow. Let this be lesson. He let his words linger, the iron taste of fear thick in the air. A chorus of frantic chittering followed, with several chieftains hastily dropping to their knees, thumping their tails against the ground in desperate submission. Scrat nodded, satisfied. Good. Now came the true test, solidifying his control. He turned his attention to the warlock engineer Vretch Gnawbolt, whose bony fingers twitched nervously over the hissing machinery on his belt. Scrat knew the warlocks of Clan Skreer were dangerous, always scheming, always seeking an angle, but they were also useful. He sheathed one of his bloodied blades and leaned in close, his whiskers brushing against Vretch's as he growled. "You build make for me, yes? Great weapons, death machines. I make you rich, fat with warpstone if you serve well." Vretch's ears flicked, his snout wrinkling. Yes, yes, Warlord Skratt, many plans, much power, make war against man-things, dwarf-things, even elf-things, but need more warpstone, more slaves, more parts. Scrat grinned, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. You will have much, obey and live live. He turned next to Packmaster Krizik, whose own corpulent form trembled. Your beasts strong fast, yes. Krizik hesitated, then nodded vigorously. Yes, yes, mighty warlord. Big mutant rat ogres kill crush for you. Scrat's tail lashed behind him. Then they fight soon. We take lesser clans, make them serve, or make them food. His words were met with an eager, shrill chorus of agreement. Already he could see the warlike glint in the eyes of the gathered Skaven. Fear had settled in, but so had greed. Visions of plunder, power, and rising in the ranks danced through their twitching little minds. Clan Vilefang would march soon. Lesser warbands of Skaven, weak, frail clans that scuttled in the tunnels beneath the Empire, lurking in ruined dwarf strongholds or festering beneath the cursed lands of Sylvania, would be given a choice: submit or perish. Scrat extended his claws, running them along the edge of one of his blades, still slick with the blood of his predecessor. We make war soon, and all will know Warlord Skratt Spinescourge is master of Vilefang. A cacophony of screeches and tail thumps filled the warren. Scrat turned to leave, his mind already racing with battle plans, expansion routes, and how best to break his rivals before they even knew they were at war. But deep within the shadows, unseen in the tangled maze of the burrow, a pair of watchful, hungry red eyes glowed, an unseen figure slinking away into the tunnels, eager to begin his own plotting. For in Skavenblight, power was never absolute, it was borrowed, fleeting, and the moment one warlord seized it, another was already sharpening a knife. Chapter 2. The Rival's Scheme. The tunnels of Skavenblight never slept. Somewhere in the endless twisting passages of the Under-Empire, things always moved. Skittering claws on damp stone, hushed whispers of treachery, and the ever-present drip of filth oozing from the cracked ceilings above. Chieftain Naskrit Fulfang moved like a shadow through the tunnels of Clan Vilefang's domain, his hunched frame wrapped in a tattered, filth-stained cloak. His fur, once a sleek shade of brown, was now mottled and thinning from the many poisons he had handled over the years. His tail twitched with every step, his beady red eyes darting left and right, searching for listening ears, hidden spies, or perhaps even an assassin sent by Skratt Spinescourge. That fool thrall rat, yes, thinks he rules commands now, but he is blind, stupid, will not see the blade at his throat until it is too late. Naskrit's lips curled into a sneer, revealing jagged yellow fangs. He had long despised Scrat, long watched as his rival carved his way to power through sheer brute force. Scrat was strong, aye, but strength was not everything. Strength could be turned, twisted, bent like rusted iron. Strength could be made to break itself. That was Naskrit's art, corruption, whispers wrought from within. Tonight his scheme began. The Warlock's doubt. The dim green glow of a warp lamp flickered as Warlock engineer Vrech Naubolt hunched over his work table, his wiry frame quivering as he adjusted the copper coils on his latest experiment. A series of twisted glass tubes pulsed with sickly green light, crackling with barely contained warp energy. He was alone, or so he thought. A faint chitter from the darkness made his fur stand on end. Who skulks crawls in my tunnels? Vrech hissed, his clawed hand snatching a crude war pistol from his belt. A figure slithered from the shadows, stepping just far enough into the dim light that his features became visible. Naskrit. The Warlock's ears twitched with suspicion. Chieftain Foulfang, you should not be here. Here. Skrat's whiskers twitched, a calculated motion of mock humility. Only wish to talk, yes, yes. Have concerns, worries. Thought best to share with wise, smart Warlock. Vrech snorted, turning his attention back to his machinery. Concerns? No time for foolish things. Need focus. Concentrate. New war machines for mighty Scrat. Yes, yes. Nas crept closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. And if he does not pay? If he does not respect, honor your work labor? You think Scrat is grateful, honest? No. He is brute thug, cares only for his own glory. Vrech froze, a single ear flicking. Yes, he had noticed Scrat's arrogance. The warlord spoke of power, of war, of conquest, but when had he last spoken of rewards for his warlock? When had he last paid what was promised? Skrat leaned in, pressing further. Perhaps it is best to ensure what machines are safe, secure, yes, that they do not explode, misfire at wrong time. Vrech's grip on his tools tightened. He did not respond, but Skrat saw the glint of doubt in his beady red eyes. Good. The seed has been planted. The Packmaster's fear. The breeding pits of Clan Vilefang reeked of rot and wet fur. Twisted, hulking rat ogres snarled in their cages, their bodies covered in scars, stitched flesh, and crude metal plating. Standing among them, his bloated belly hanging over his rusted belt, was Packmaster Krizik. The rat swayed slightly as he fed one of the creatures, its massive clawed paw slamming against the bars as it gulped down a raw hunk of meat. Krizik was a coward. Skrat knew this well, and cowards were easy to bend, easy to break. Krizik turned as he heard Skrat approach, his tail flicking in irritation. "Hen, what does sneaky scum Skrat want?" he grumbled, rubbing at his filth-stained whiskers. Skrat did not respond immediately. Instead, he strolled up to one of the cages, watching the massive rat ogre within as it gnawed mindlessly on a bone. Then, in a low, careful whisper, he spoke. "You trust Scrat." Krizik let out a scoffing chitter. "Pah! Do not trust any rat, but he is warlord, so I serve." "Serve?" Skrat's tail curled. "But for how long? You think Scrat will keep feeding fat, lazy Krizik when war begins? No. He will take your beasts, send them to die, leave you with nothing. Krizik's beady red eyes twitched. "No, Skrat lies, wants to make me betray ruin." But doubt had taken root. Skrat's voice slithered through the air like poisoned silk. "You are strong, yes, but Scrat, he wants you weak. He does not want competition. You think he lets you live when he no longer needs rat ogres? When all strong clan beasts belong to him?" Krizik's claws flexed against his stomach, his dull mind slowly digesting the idea. Skrat let the silence settle. Then, with a final whisper, he spoke the words that would fester like a wound. Watch, yes? Watch and see what Scrap does to those who think they are safe." And then he was gone. The first cracks. As Skrat crept back through the tunnels, he could feel it, the first fractures in Scrat's rule. He had not needed threats nor war, he had used words. The Warlock engineer doubted. Would his weapons fail when Scrat needed them most? The Packmaster feared. Would he truly risk his greatest creatures for a war that might leave him weak? Scrat was still Warlord, but Warlords do not fall from blades alone. They fall from the rotting whispers in the dark. Skrat grinned, his yellowed fangs glinting in the dim torchlight. Skratt Spinescourge would never see his fall coming. Chapter 3. A Fragile Pact. The air inside the cavern was thick with the stench of burning warpstone, scorched metal, and the acrid tang of unwashed Skaven bodies. Steam hissed from rusted pipes, and thick cables slithered like twisted veins across the chamber floor. Sparks crackled overhead as a massive generator churned, green lightning arcing wildly along its copper coils. Here, in the depths of a forgotten ruin, the forges of Clan Rusttooth churned. Warlord Skratt Spinescourge stood at the center of the chamber, his beady red eyes darting across the mechanical monstrosities that surrounded him. Hulking doomflayers, their blades glinting wickedly, lined the walls. A trio of half-mad warlock engineers cackled and chittered, adjusting the flickering controls of an experimental warpfire cannon. Above them, perched on a throne of rusted iron and shattered gears, sat Warlock Skratt Rusttooth. The leader of Clan Rusttooth was thin, skeletal even, his patchy fur singed and falling away in places, revealing raw, pink skin beneath. His left arm was missing, replaced by a crude, jerking mechanical claw, its servos whirring noisily. His tail was a shriveled, blackened stub, burned away by some past experiment. But what he lacked in physical strength, he made up for in raw intelligence. Skratt tapped his claws against the warped metal of his throne, his whiskers twitching. "You come to deal bargain, yes, Warlord Skratt." His voice was like scraping metal, his sharp teeth flashing in the flickering green light. Scrat nodded, stepping forward, his tail flicking behind him. Yes, strong war machines, great death devices. You make for my war. I pay much warpstone, yes. Skratt's eyes gleamed hungrily at the mention of warpstone, but he leaned forward, clicking his mechanical claw against the throne's armrest. Much warpstone. How much? Much. Scrat reached into his belt and pulled out a jagged chunk of raw warpstone, its green glow pulsating like a diseased heart. The warlock engineers around the room let out high-pitched squeals of excitement, their claws twitching involuntarily. Skratt's whiskers twitched again. Yes, good. But what else? Clan Rusttooth does not die for free. Need protection, need safety. Scrat's tail lashed impatiently. You get both. We war together, yes. I win, you win. Skratt's eyes narrowed. He tapped his claw again. Click. Then, slowly, he nodded. Yes. Clan Rusttooth agrees. The chamber filled with the excited chittering of warlocks and engineers. A pact had been made. The whisper of treachery. But, in the shadows of the chamber, another pair of red eyes watched. Nascrit Foolfang lurked unseen in the tangled mess of pipes and machinery, his sharp claws gripping the rusted iron as he listened, waiting for his moment. A deal made in Skavenblight was never truly stable. Nascrit knew this well. He had watched Scrat seize power, had already begun his slow poisoning of the Warlord's allies. Now he would rot this pact from within. Later that night, as the forges dimmed and the warlock engineers scurried off to their dens, Nascrit made his move. He found Warlock Skratt alone, muttering to himself over the schematics of some strange unholy contraption, a rattling gun fused with a warp lightning conductor. The warlock's ears twitched at the sound of Nascrit's approach, but he did not look up. Chieftain Foulfang, sneaky coward rat, what do you want? Want? Nascrit grinned, baring yellowed teeth. Come to speak, Warren, yes. About Scrat. Skratt finally looked up, his beady eyes narrowing. Warren? Nascrit took a step closer, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial hiss. You trust Scrat? Trust his words, promises? Skratt let out a sharp, chittering laugh. No, Skaven trusts, but he pays well. Nascrit flicked his tail. Yes, pays well now, But what happens when no more need for Rusttooth, huh? Griznak's mechanical claw clenched, its servos grinding. Skrat leaned in further, his breath hot against the Warlock's ear. "Ya think Scrat keeps paying after he wins? No. He kills you. Takes machines for himself." Griznak's whiskers twitched. It made sense. Scrat was a brute, a warlord who led by dominance. He did not build, did not invent. Why would he continue to pay for Rusttooth's machines when he could simply take them? A slow, calculated grin spread across Skrat's face. Perhaps Warlock be smart, clever, yes, make machine weapons. But also make safe? Griznak's mind raced. Yes, he could build machines, but also build fail-safes, weak points, self-destruction switches. If Scrat ever turned on him, Rusttooth would burn him to the ground. Click, 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 click. Griznak's claw rapped against the metal once more. Yes. Warlock will be smart, clever. Will watch Scrat close. Skrat's grin widened. Another crack in Scrat's foundation. A pact doomed to break. By morning, Scrat left the Rusttooth forges unaware that his new allies had already begun preparing for his betrayal. The pact existed, but it was fragile, held together not by trust, but by convenience. And convenience never lasted long in Skavenblight. Chapter 4. Raid on the Surface. The air above ground was different. For most Skaven, the surface world was a place of fear, too open, too bright, too full of sky and death. But for Warlord Skratt Spinescourge, the surface was a place of opportunity. Blood, loot, meat. The caravan moved slowly along the cracked road, wagons heavy with grain, cloth, and, most importantly, chests of gold from the Empire's border towns. A handful of armed guards in chainmail walked alongside the carts, their torches flickering against the dim light of Moorsleep, the sickly green moon that loomed overhead. They thought themselves safe here, on the edges of the Drakwold. They were wrong. From beneath the dirt and rot, Scrat's warband lay in wait. Hundreds of red eyes gleamed in the tunnels beneath the road, hidden beneath a thin crust of earth and wood. Burrowed up from the depths of the Under-Empire, like worms, the Skaven had spent days digging these passages, crawling like filth beneath the humans' feet, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now it was time. Scrat raised one clawed fist, his tail curling in anticipation. Beside him his warriors, clan rats, hulking storm vermin, and the horrid mutated monstrosities of the Rusttooth warlocks, bristled with barely restrained hunger. The warlord's fangs glinted in the darkness. Kill them all, take all shinies, leave none alive. He slammed his fist against the tunnel wall, signaling the attack. The ambush. The world exploded in violence. The ground erupted, sending plumes of dust and dirt into the air, as Skave warriors poured from below like a plague of biting rats. The first human sentry barely had time to scream before a jagged spear was driven through his chest, black blood spraying across the side of a wagon. The caravan guards panicked. They fumbled for their weapons, shouting, calling for order, but there was no time. Scrat's storm vermin struck fast and hard, their black armor gleaming in the torchlight as they hacked down their enemies with savage efficiency. One storm vermin cleaved a man from shoulder to belly, his halberd glistening with intestines as he kicked the corpse aside. Another ran his war blade through a guard's throat, twisting the jagged metal so that the body convulsed before falling limp. A warlock engineer, standing atop a half-buried doomflare, let out a shriek of laughter before flipping a rusted switch. The doomflare roared to life. Its serrated wheels spun, tearing through the mud and flesh alike. A charging Empire soldier was split in half, his body flung in opposite directions as the grinding saws churned through armor, bone, and sinew. Another guard tried to run, but a mutant rat ogre leapt upon him, its massive claws ripping the man's ribcage open like a rotten sack of meat. Blood soaked the ground. Scrat himself was a whirlwind of death, his twin warblades slashing through flesh as he danced between his enemies like a creature possessed. One unlucky soldier lunged at him with the longsword, too slow. Scrat ducked under the blade, slashing upward in a brutal arc that tore the man's jaw from his skull. The human collapsed, twitching, as Scrat kicked his body away. Another soldier tried to raise a crossbow, but Scrat was faster. He threw a poisoned dagger, the jagged blade burying itself in the human's eye socket, sending him crashing into the mud, screaming. By now the caravan was in chaos, screams, the stench of gore, the shrill cries of Skaven feasting on still warm corpses. The guards had been slaughtered, their blood pooling in the dirt like spilled ink. The battle was over. The vanishing loot. Scrat stood atop one of the wagons, his chest heaving, his claws slick with blood. His warband chittered and screeched in triumph, hauling sacks of grain, barrels of wine, and, most importantly, the chests of gold. Warped wagons, dragged from their tunnels, were loaded with plunder, the Skaven moving quickly to disappear before reinforcements could arrive. But as the last of the loot was secured, Scrat noticed something wrong. One of his chieftains, Snick Gnawtail, a cunning and cruel rat with an ugly scar across his snout, scuttled toward him, looking nervous. Warlord, bad news." Scrat's ears flicked. What? Snick wrung his claws. "The gold, it is missing." Scrat's blood ran cold. He leapt down from the wagon, his tail whipping as he grabbed Snick by the throat, slamming him into the side of the cart. Where is it?" Scrat snarled, his fangs inches from the lesser Skaven's face. Snick gasped, sputtered, his claws scrabbling weakly. Do not know. Was here before battle." Scrat's rage boiled over. With a snarl, he drove his warblade into Snick's gut, ripping it upward with a sickening crunch of bone and flesh. The chieftain let out a gurgling screech, blood bubbling from his lips as his insides spilled onto the ground in a wet heap. The gathered Skaven fell silent. Skrat ripped his blade free, letting Snick's twitching corpse fall to the mud. His red eyes blazed as he looked at his warriors. "Find it! Now!" he bellowed, his voice filled with raw fury. The warband scattered, scrambling over the dead, ripping open sacks, clawing through the wagons. But the gold was gone. Someone had stolen it. And somewhere, in the shadows of the battlefield, a figure watched, a flickering silhouette with beady red eyes and a cruel, knowing smile. Naskrit Fulfang. The seeds of Skrat's downfall had been sown. Chapter 5. The Whispering Council. The rout spreads. The tunnels beneath Skavenblight were always filled with noise, the endless chittering of scheming rats, the gnawing of teeth on bone, the hissing of steam vents leaking toxic fumes. But tonight, in the dark depths of an abandoned burrow, the sounds were hushed. The Skaven gathered here, speaking in low, cautious whispers. This was no ordinary war meeting. This was treason, the gathering of warlords. A crude stone chamber had been carved from the rock, its walls damp with moisture and covered in the scratches of 1,000 Skaven claws. A single flickering warp lamp cast long, jagged shadows across the assembled figures. 5 warlords crouched in a rough circle, their eyes shifting nervously as they spoke in quick, quiet bursts. Their armor was mismatched, scavenged from battles long past, their weapons rusted but sharp. These were not the mighty leaders of great Skaven clans. These were the desperate, the ambitious, the ones who saw an opportunity to rise. And among them, unseen in the gloom, Naskrit Foulfang listened. His ears twitched, his tail flicking as he absorbed every word, his lips curling into a thin smile as the seeds of treachery took root. The largest of the warlords, Warlord Spiketail, a brute with jagged black armor and a wickedly barbed tail, bared his fangs. Scrat grows too bold, too greedy, yes, yes. Takes much, much, gives little, little. Thinks he is mighty, mighty warlord, but where is gold? Gold, stolen, lost. Another, a leaner rat with burned fur and a missing ear, known as Hisric Quickfang, nodded sharply. Yes, yes, gold gone, no reward, reward. Scrat spends all on warp weapons and big ugly war beasts. What of us? The others hissed in agreement, their tails twitching in silent fury. Askrit grinned in the shadows. Good, good. Let 'em stew. Let them doubt. The third warlord, Kritzel the Pale, let out a dry chitter. His pink, sickly fur was thin, his ribs visible beneath his ragged robes. Too many enemies, yes, yes. Scrat makes war on man-things, but forgets we have rivals. Warlocks grow restless, grey seers watch. What if they do not approve? Varks growled, his claws scratching against the stone. Scrat does not think, only fight kill, does not listen to clever thinkers. Naskrit finally chose his moment. Slowly he stepped forward into the flickering light, his hunched frame wrapped in a cloak of black rat hide, his beady red eyes gleaming with dark amusement. Here, listen, yes, yes. He purred, his voice smooth like poisoned silk. You speak true. Scrat is brute, Scrat is fool, but you cannot kill him. Yet, no. The warlords turned, their noses twitching at his sudden presence. Hisric's claws tensed over the dagger on his belt. Why not, foul fang? You come to protect, defend him? Naskrit laughed, a low, chittering sound. No. I hate to spice Scrat more than any. But you think, kill Scrat now. And what happens? Yes. The warlords hesitated. Kurtzel's tail curled, his mind working. The Grey Seers. They would come. Neskrit nodded. Yes. Come, kill us all. They do not like mind warlords changing too fast. Scrat's still strong, still many warriors. If we strike now, we are crushed, killed. Varch snarled. Then what? We do nothing? We let Scrat keep ruling? Naskrit leaned in closer, his eyes glinting. No. We make Scrat weaken, make him lose face. We make his war fail. Make him look fool before all. Then, when warlock things and chieftain rats lose faith, trust in Scrat, then we strike kill, yes. The warlords glanced at each other, considering. It made sense. Scrat's rule was already crumbling, his own soldiers whispering of the missing gold, of the failures, of the growing arrogance. If Scrat failed again, if he was seen as weak, then his own warband would turn on him. Then, and only then, would it be safe to move against him. Hisric let out a slow, thoughtful hiss. Yes. Make Scrat fall on his own claws. Yes. Varch's lips curled into a cruel grin. Yes. Make him drown in his own failure. Naskrit let out a slow, satisfied chitter. The plan was set. The warlords would not strike, yet. Instead, they would feed Scrat's downfall. They would spread rumors, sabotage his next attack, turn his allies against him. And when the time was right, they would bury the warlord in the filth of his own failures. The first rumors. That very night, the whispers spread like disease. The warlords spoke soft, but their words carried far. Scrat has angered the Grey Seers. Scrat loses gold, grows careless. Scrat's weapons fail. Rustoof does not trust him. Skrat's war is doomed. Doomed. By the time dawn broke over Skavenblight, the first cracks in Skrat's power were already forming. And somewhere deep in his tunnels, Neskrit Foulfang watched and waited. His knife was not yet ready, but soon, very soon. Chapter 6. Sabotage in the Warrens. The beast pits of Clan Vilefang were a place of horror. Deep beneath the crumbling tunnels of Skavenblight, the breeding pits churned with a stench of filth, blood, and fear. Here Packmaster Krizik ruled, his swollen frame swaying as he stomped through the muck, prodding and whipping his mutated horrors into submission. Inside rusted cages and rotting pens, massive, hulking rat ogres twitched and snarled, their thick muscles rippling beneath patchwork fur and scarred flesh. Their yellow eyes gleamed with animalistic rage, their clawed hands clenching in anticipation of the coming battle. The war was set to begin soon. Warlord Skratt Spinescourge had planned an ambush, a brutal, decisive strike against Clan Vilefang, a rival warband that had defied his rule. The rat ogres would lead the charge, smashing through enemy ranks like a living battering ram, their monstrous claws shredding flesh and armor alike. Skrat's storm vermin would follow, cutting down anything that survived the initial carnage. It was a perfect plan, until everything went wrong. The dying beasts. The first screams came from the pits before the sun had even set. Scrat had been in his war chamber, poring over a crude, blood-stained map, when a terrified clan rat burst into the room, his fur matted with sweat. "Warlord, Warlord," he squealed, falling to his knees, his tail curled tight between his legs in terror. "The war beasts, they are dying." Skrat's blood ran cold. Impossible. His tail lashed furiously as he shoved the clan rat aside and stormed toward the pits, his claws clicking against the damp stone floor. Behind him, a pack of his personal storm vermin followed, their weapons at the ready. When he entered the beast chambers, the stench hit him first. Not the usual filth, blood, and decay, but something worse, something rotten. Skrat's eyes darted around the room and his ears flattened in fury. His war beasts were dying. The rat ogres twitched and convulsed inside their cages, their bloated bodies heaving and shuddering, their mouths foaming as black bile spilled from their fangs. One of the creatures, a massive brute with jagged bone spikes protruding from its back, let out a horrific wail before vomiting up chunks of its own stomach, collapsing in a quivering heap of torn flesh and bubbling innards. Another, mad with agony, slammed itself against the iron bars of its cage, shattering its own skull in a gruesome explosion of bone and brain matter. The remaining beasts shrieked and howled, their claws tearing at their own flesh, ripping out their own throats in a desperate bid to escape the pain. Skrat's rage boiled over. What had happened? Who did this? His storm vermin flinched at the raw fury in his voice, their tails curling inward. Packmaster Krizik, his fat form shaking, scurried forward on all fours, his paws clutching his whip like a child clinging to a toy. "Do not know, no, Warlord. The beasts they were strong before, then sick," Scrat snarled, shoving Krizik to the ground, his claws wrapped tight around the Packmaster's throat. "You feed them, yes. You watch them?" Skrat's voice was a low, venomous growl. How do they sick die if you see everything?" Krizik wheezed, clawing at Skrat's grip, his eyes bulging. "Poisoned," he gasped, spitting bile as he struggled to breathe. "War poison. In food. Food!" Skrat froze. His claws twitched against Krizik's throat. Then he dropped the Packmaster, letting him crumple to the floor in a coughing heap. Poison. Not from battle, not from infection. Deliberate sabotage. Treachery. His claws clenched into tight fists, his mind racing with fury. "Who?" he demanded, his voice a violent snarl, his tail lashing like a whip. The gathered Skaven shrunk back, terrified, their eyes darting nervously. None dared speak. None wanted to be the next corpse at Skrat's feet. But Skrat already knew. The rotten hand of Neskrit. Somewhere, in the darkest corners of the tunnels, a pair of gleaming red eyes watched. Neskri Foulfang smirked, his jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. His plan had worked. The poison had seeped into the war beast's food slowly, over weeks, unseen, undetected. At first the creatures had only grown sluggish, their hunger fading slightly. Then their bellies swelled, their eyes darkened, and then the dying began. And now, with Skrat's war beasts rotting in their own bile, his next battle was already lost. Skrat had no way of knowing who had done it. But Naskrith knew what mattered most. Doubt. The whispers would spread. Skrat's own troops would question him, and soon the Warlord's empire would begin to collapse from within. Skrat's wrath. Back in the beast pits, Skrat stood among the bodies of his dying monsters, his claws dripping with the blood of those he had already killed in his rage. A chieftain who had hesitated to answer his demands lay twitching on the floor, Skrat's dagger buried in his eye socket. A low-ranking warlock engineer who had been tasked with monitoring the beasts was still screaming, pinned beneath a slab of metal Skrat had thrown in fury. Skrat panted, his mind ablaze. His beasts were dead, his army was weakened, his enemies would soon smell weakness. But he was not beaten. No, whoever had done this would suffer. His red eyes gleamed with hatred as he turned to his remaining warriors, his voice a guttural snarl. Find them. Find the rat who did this. His storm vermin scattered, diving into the tunnels like starving predators, searching for an enemy they would never find. And as Skrat's rage burned like fire deep in the shadows, Naskrith grinned. The Warlord's empire was already beginning to rot. Chapter 7. Clash with the Plague Monks. The tunnels stank of death and rot. Not the usual filth that clung to every surface of Skavenblight, no, this was worse. The air itself was poisoned, thick with the choking fumes of pestilence, decay, and something far fouler. Warlord Skratt Spinescourge stood at the head of his warband, his sharp teeth bared in a snarl, his claws twitching over the hilt of his warblades. The verminous filth of clan pestilence had claimed these tunnels, spreading their disease-ridden filth through the lower burrows like a creeping sickness. Now they would burn. His warband, a mix of armored storm vermin, gutter runners, and what remained of his war beasts, stood poised, hunched in readiness, red eyes gleaming in the gloom. The loss of his war beasts had crippled his strength, but he would not show weakness. He could not. The skittering of claws echoed through the tunnel ahead. The plague monks were coming, and Skrat would meet them with blood and steel. The swarm of pestilence. The first wave of plague monks came in a screeching, filth-ridden tide, their tattered robes crusted with dried pus and festering sores. Warped, jagged blades clutched in rotting hands, their eyes wild with sickness, they charged with fanatical fury. Skrat did not wait for them to strike first. Kill them! Burn the filth things, he roared, swinging his war blade forward like a signal fire. His storm vermin surged, black armor glinting in the flickering torchlight as they clashed against the diseased horde. The first plague monk leapt forward, its mouth frothing with bile, swinging a rusted flail crusted with dried blood and filth. Skrat met him mid-air, spinning beneath the blow and slashing upward. His warblade cleaved through the monk's bloated belly, spilling black, worm-infested intestines onto the stone floor. The plague monk collapsed, shrieking as its own bile dissolved its flesh, but already another took its place. The tunnel exploded into chaos. Plague monks threw themselves at Skrat's warband, their blades hacking, their diseased claws tearing at armor and fur. A storm vermin to Skrat's left screamed. A plague monk's jagged dagger lodged deep into his throat. He gurgled, blood bubbling from his lips as the monk twisted the blade, ripping the wound wider. Another storm vermin collapsed, his face twisting in agony as his flesh blackened and bubbled, his armor melting from the sheer virulence of the pestilence poison. Scrat fought like a thing possessed, his war blades flashing in brutal arcs. One plague monk lunged, Scrat ducked, and with a single fluid motion he drove his blade through the monk's skull, twisting until the bone cracked. A second came at him from the side. Scrat whirled, his tail slamming into its legs, knocking the monk off balance before ramming a dagger into its chest, ripping downward in a grotesque spray of putrid blood. The fighting was merciless, the tunnels now slick with bile, filth, and steaming blood. Skrat's warriors were winning, but at a terrible cost. The betrayal in the ranks. In the midst of battle, a figure watched from the shadows, his beady red eyes glinting with quiet amusement. Neskrit Fullfang. He had seen his chance, and like the opportunistic rat he was, he had taken it. Before the battle he had whispered into the ears of the Warlock engineers, suggesting that their warp-fire throwers should be held back, just in case. He had convinced Skrat's lesser chieftains that the storm vermin should be sent into the tunnels first, to break the enemy lines. And when the battle began, he had held his own troops back, just enough to let Skrat's forces take the brunt of the casualties. Every dead storm vermin, every butchered Skaven, every fallen beast was one less obstacle in Neskrit's way. And Scrat did not even know the cost of victory. By the time the last plague monk lay twitching on the ground, Scrat stood among the corpses of his own warriors, his breath ragged, his muscles burning. His storm vermin were decimated, his warband was crippled, and the plague monks, though destroyed, had taken more from him than he had won. Scrat spat onto the corpses, rage bubbling in his chest. This was not a victory. It was a warning. Somewhere, someone had set him up. Someone had ensured his forces suffered more than they should have. His red eyes burned with fury. Whoever it was, whoever had dared to weaken him like this, they would die. The shadow that smiled. As Scrat limped back toward his tunnels, his warband licking its wounds, a shadow moved in the darkness. Neskrit watched from the safety of the tunnel mouth, his whiskers twitching in amusement. Scrat had won, but at what cost? His army was weakened. His warriors questioned him. And soon, when the next battle came, Scrat would fall. Neskrit bared his fangs in a grinning sneer before vanishing back into the tunnels. The game was almost at its end. Chapter 8. The Warlock's Betrayal. The tunnels of Skavenblight were never silent. Even in the depths of night, the warren pulsed with the endless chittering of thousands of scheming rats, the distant clang of metal against metal, and the muffled screams of the dying. But tonight, something felt wrong. The meeting with Warlock Grisnak. Warlord Skratt Spinescourge scowled as he stalked through the narrow tunnel, his claws flexing over the hilts of his warblades. His storm vermin honor guard flanked him, their beady red eyes scanning the passage with wary suspicion. He hated dealing with Warlock engineers. They were liars, cheats, cowards, always building and breaking in the same breath. But Scrat needed their weapons, their war machines, their warp lightning cannons and doom flayers if he was to crush his enemies. And so, despite his gut-screaming warnings, he had come. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, the walls lined with pipes spewing clouds of foul-smelling green gas. Strange glowing runes flickered erratically on metal plating, and crude machinery hissed and sparked in chaotic rhythms. At the center of it all, perched atop a throne of rusted gears and crackling wires, was Warlock Grisnak Rusttooth. His skeletal frame twitched, his mechanical claw whirring as he tapped it against the armrest. His one organic eye gleamed with madness, while the other, a warped, glassy lens embedded in his skull, flickered with unstable warp energy. "Scrat, yes, yes," Grisnak called, his voice a high-pitched screech. "Come, come, see new weapons, glorious, deadly. Kill, kill, man-things, dwarf things, elf things." Scrat stopped just short of the throne, his tail twitching. "Show quickly, Warlock. Have little time. Must prepare for war. War." Grisnak grinned too wide, his fangs yellowed and sharp. "Oh, yes, Warlord. You will see, very close. A click. A hum. A sudden shift in the air. Scrat's fur bristled. His eyes darted up, to the twisted metal pipes above, to the faint, pulsating green glow that now illuminated the room. The trap. The lightning strike. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber. A shrill, mechanical shriek that set Scrat's teeth on edge. Scrat barely had time to dodge before the room exploded in a crackling storm of green lightning. A warp lightning coil above him discharged, sending a bolt of raw, screaming energy slamming into the floor where he had just stood. The impact shattered the stone, sending jagged shards flying in all directions. Two storm vermin were not so lucky. One was hit directly, his armor melting into his flesh as his body convulsed violently, his screams turning into a hideous, gurgling screech before his skull burst apart from the sheer force of the energy. The other storm vermin tried to run, but the second bolt found him mid-stride. His body locked in place, every muscle seizing as his eyes boiled and burst, green flames erupting from his mouth as he collapsed into a smoldering heap. "Treachery," Scrat snarled, rolling forward as another bolt of warp lightning ripped through the air, scorching the tip of his tail. Grisnak laughed wildly, his mechanical claw twitching with excitement. Yes, burn die, Warlord, no need you any more. I rule now. I take your armies. Yes. Rusttooth rises. Scrat moved fast. With a feral snarl, he lunged forward, one warblade flashing through the air, only to slam into an invisible barrier. The warp shield pulsed, sending a shockwave of energy that blasted Scrat backward, slamming him into a metal pipe. Pain flared in his chest, and his vision spun. Grisnak cackled again, his mechanical claw slamming down onto a rusted control lever. From the walls, metal rods shot out, spitting arcs of warp lightning in every direction. Scrat's remaining stone vermin screamed, their fur igniting, their bodies twisting and writhing as they were reduced to blackened husks in mere moments. His guard was dead. His war gear was failing. But Scrat was not done. The kill. Through the pain, through the burning, Scrat's mind was clear. Warlocks were smart, clever, tricky, but they were not warriors. And Scrat was a killer. As Grisnak reached for another lever, Scrat lunged forward. This time, he didn't aim for the Warlock. He aimed for the machinery. His warblade slashed through the rusted pipes, severing a thick, blackened cable that fed the warp lightning coils. The room exploded. A massive shockwave tore through the chamber, sending metal debris flying. A column of green fire erupted from the shattered console, engulfing Grisnak in a searing inferno. The Warlock's screams turned to gurgles as his flesh blackened, melted from his bones. His mechanical claw twitched wildly, his one good eye bursting in a sickening pop as he collapsed into the flames. Scrat staggered to his feet, smoke rising from his fur, his armor scorched and cracked. The room was falling apart. His weapons were ruined, his storm vermin dead. The Rusttooth clan would never support him now. But he was alive, and that meant someone would suffer. Scrat turned, his red eyes burning with rage. There was only one rat who could have convinced Grisnak to betray him. Nuskrit. The game was over. It was time to gut the traitor. Chapter 9. Signs of the Horned Rat. The tunnels smelled of burning flesh. The choking stench of scorched fur, melted metal, and charred bones still clung to Skrat's wargear, the lingering scars of Warlock Grisnak's betrayal. His body ached, his armor was ruined, and his forces were bleeding out faster than he could replace them. The Warlock engineers had abandoned him, his war beasts were dead, and the plague monks had cost him more than he had gained. But through it all, one truth gnawed at his mind like a starving rat in the dark. Skrat. Scrat knew the bastard was working against him, whispering in the dark, pulling the strings behind these treacheries and failures. But he had no proof. And proof was everything. The arrival of the Grey Seer. The chittering hordes of Clan Vilefang scurried and trembled as the news spread through the tunnels. A Grey Seer had come. Scrat stood at the heart of his warren, watching as his warriors cowered before the approaching figure. Storm vermin averted their gazes, lesser chieftains grovelled, even the cruelest packmasters curled their tails between their legs in fear. Grey Seers were not to be questioned, not to be defied. They were the mouthpieces of the Horned Rat, and their words carried the weight of divine doom. Scrat's claws flexed on the hilts of his warblades. He had no fear of gods or prophets, only of daggers in the dark. The Grey Seer entered the chamber, his twisted, hunched form shrouded in robes of sickly green and crawling black runes. His horns curled like jagged lightning bolts, his pale fur matted with warpstone dust, and his clawed hands gripped a rusted staff, crackling with the hum of barely contained energy. His eyes glowed with warp magic, pits of hungry green light that burned into the souls of those who looked too long. Scrat met his gaze directly. A slow, thin smile curled the Grey Seer's lips. A knowing smile. Many troubles, yes, the Grey Seer rasped, his voice dry and crackling, like leaves burning in a fire. Scrat's tail flicked. Yes. Many betrayals, many lies. Who sent you, Seer Rat? The Grey Seer let out a soft, chittering laugh, his claws twitching over his staff. The Horned Rat speaks yes, sends signs, sends omens, warns of treachery, of war. Warlords who think they are safe. A murmur rippled through the gathered Skaven. Skrat's eyes narrowed. You speak riddles, Seer Rat. Mean what you mean. The Grey Seer snapped his gaze onto Scrat, and for a moment everything fell silent. Even the lesser Skaven stopped breathing, their bodies tensed, as if expecting a divine execution. And then the Seer spoke. The prophecy of treachery. Your blades will break rack, the Seer hissed. Your trusteds will bite at your throat. Your armies will flee, and in the end, you will see. The Grey Seer's eyes flickered with raw green light, his body shuddering as if possessed. The traitor will grin as you fall into ruin. The words hung in the air, thick as poisoned gas. Scrat felt his blood boil. A traitor. He knew who it was. Skrat. The filthy worm rat had been undermining him for weeks, maybe even months. But without proof, he could do nothing. If he accused Skrat without evidence, the other chieftains would see him as weak, as paranoid. They would turn on him instead. He needed proof. And until he had it, he needed to play the game. The Seer's departure. The Grey Seer watched Scrat carefully, as if seeing the warlord's mind turning like rusted gears. A slow, toothy smile curled across the prophet's lips. Think, warlord. Watch, close. And then, without another word, the Seer turned, his staff tapping against the stone as he skittered back into the tunnels, vanishing into the shadows. The silence lingered long after he was gone. Scrat stood, claws clenched, teeth grinding. And somewhere, in the gathered horde, Skrat Falfang watched, his lips curled into the faintest grin. The Grey Seer had done his work for him. Now, all he had to do was wait. Chapter 10. Blood in the Depths. The tunnels beneath Skavenblight were vast, a twisting labyrinth of filth and shadows where power was won not by strength alone, but by cunning, treachery, and blood. And tonight there would be blood. The fracturing of Clan Vilefang. Skratt Spinescourge paced in the depths of his war chamber, his claws flexing restlessly. The Grey Seer's words still burned in his mind. Your trusteds will gnaw-bite at your throat. His warband was falling apart. His chieftains whispered behind his back, his warlock engineers had fled, and his storm vermin were fewer by the day. The loss of his war beasts, the sabotage, the betrayal by Warlock Grisnak, all had weakened him, in the eyes of his own kin. Skrat was behind it, he knew it, but the coward had left no proof. And now Skrat's lesser chieftains were questioning his rule. They needed a reminder, a bloody one. The ambush in the depths. The meeting had been called in a secluded tunnel, away from prying eyes. 4 of Skrat's chieftains had gathered, their fur twitching with unease. Hisrik Quickfang, Kritzel the Pale, Vark Spiketail, and Packmaster Krizik, all had once sworn loyalty to him. Now they whispered of his weakness. They spoke of turning away from his rule. They had come here thinking they would plot in secret. They were wrong. The moment the 4 Skaven stepped into the cavern, the trap was sprung. Scrab's hidden storm vermin erupted from the darkness, their black armor glinting in the dim torchlight, blades flashing as they fell upon the traitors. The first scream was cut short as a jagged halberd drove through Hisrik's back, bursting from his chest in a spray of gore. His tail spasmed, his claws twitching helplessly before his storm vermin attacker wrenched the blade free, sending his body crumpling into the dirt. Kritzel tried to run, but Scrat was faster. The warlord lunged forward, one of his war blades whistling through the air, and severed the chieftain's leg at the knee. Kritzel collapsed, shrieking, his hands clutching the raw, gushing stump where his leg had been. Skart loomed over him, fangs bared. No more whispers. Yes, yes, he hissed. Before Kritzel could plead for his life, Scrat drove his second warblade into the chieftain's skull, splitting it in half with a sickening crack. The betrayers fight back. Vark Spiketail was not a coward. Unlike the others, he did not freeze, he fought. With a snarl, he whipped his tail forward, striking one of Skrat's storm vermin across the face, sending the warrior staggering back. Then he lunged, his barbed warblade carving through the air towards Skrat's throat. But Skrat was a warlord. With a flick of his wrist, he parried the strike, twisting his blade against Vark's own, locking the 2 weapons together. The 2 Skaven snarled and chittered, their faces inches apart, fangs bared in rage. You are weak, Spinescourge, Vark spat, pushing forward, forcing Skrat back inch by inch. You let Warlock betray burn you. Let your war beasts die. Die! You are failure. Skrat let out a snarl of pure fury and head-butted Vark so hard his snout shattered. Vark stumbled back shrieking, blood pouring from his ruined nose. Skrat took his opening. He slashed low, his warblade cleaving through Vark's stomach. The traitor warlord let out a choked gasp, staring down in horror as his intestines spilled onto the cavern floor, steaming in the cold air. Scratch kicked him onto his back, watching as the chieftain clutched at his own guts, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. Look now, yes, Scratch sneered, grinding his foot down onto Vark's throat. You do not question Warlord Skratt, and live life? With a vicious snarl he drove his war blade down, skewering Vark's throat, silencing him forever. The last traitor. Only one remained, Packmaster Krizik. The fat Skaven trembled, his filthy claws raised in surrender, his beady eyes wide with terror. "No, no, Warlord. Krizik never betray. Always loyal. Loyal? Yes, yes." Scrat stared down at him, his warblades dripping with blood. Then, with a slow, knowing grin, he stepped back. "Good, good," he hissed. "You live." Krizik let out a choked gasp of relief, sagging forward in exhaustion. Then Scrat gestured to his storm vermin. Break his legs." Before Krizik could react, 2 storm vermin surged forward, bringing their halberds down onto his knees. The packmaster's bones snapped like rotten wood. His screams echoed through the cavern. He would live, but he would never run again. A Pyrrhic victory. Scrat stood among the corpses of the traitors, his fur matted with blood, his war blade slick with gore. The surviving warriors stared at him in silence. He had won. He had reminded them all what happened to those who doubted his rule. And yet, something felt wrong. He could see it in their eyes, the way his warriors did not cheer, the way his chieftains did not praise his strength. They were afraid, but not loyal. Fear was a powerful tool, but it did not last. And in the shadows of the tunnels, unseen and unheard, Nascrid Foulfang watched. His lips curled into a slow, amused grin. Scrat had murdered his own chieftains, weakened his own warband, and made himself look more unstable than ever. The time was almost right. Soon Skratt Spinescourge would fall, and Nascrid would be the one holding the knife. Chapter 11. A Price on His Head. The tunnels of Skavenblight had always been filled with whispers, but now they spoke of one thing only: the bounty on Warlord Skratt Spinescourge. It spread like a disease, slithering through the ranks of his warband, carried on the sharp, twitching tongues of scheming chieftains, cowardly clan rats, and even his own storm vermin. Dead, they want him dead. Big warp stone reward, much gold. Kill Scrat, take his place. Scrat could hear it. It echoed in the tunnels, in the shadows, in the backs of his own thoughts. Someone had put a price on his head, and he had no idea who. Paranoia takes root. The warlord stalked through the corridors of his warren, his red eyes darting from side to side, his claws gripping the hilts of his warblade so tightly his knuckles ached. Everyone was a threat. Everyone wanted him dead. His own warband walked with a wary distance, their eyes flicking away whenever he turned too quickly. His remaining chieftains spoke in hushed tones, their tails twitching when he passed. Scrat could see the doubt in them, the hesitation, and in Skaven society, fear did not bring loyalty. It brought daggers in the dark. The first assassin struck 3 nights after the whispers began. Scrat had been resting in his personal chamber, a carved-out cavern filled with half-loaded treasures, gnawed bones, and crude maps of future conquests. He did not sleep. Skaven never truly slept. Instead, he lay hunched on his throne, his warblade across his lap, his tail twitching with the ever-present paranoia that gnawed at him. And then, a sound. A soft shuffle of claws on stone. The scent of poison. Scrat's eyes snapped open just as a dark shape lunged from the ceiling, daggers flashing in the dim green torchlight. An Eshin assassin. Scrat rolled to the side, his warblade slashing up in a vicious arc. The dagger grazed his shoulders, slicing through fur and flesh, but he did not slow. The assassin landed in a crouch, tail whipping behind him, his face masked, his black robes fluttering as he vanished into the shadows. Scrat let out a snarl, his ears flicking. He listened. The assassin was there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting to strike again. He had seconds. Scrat lunged, not forward but backward, rolling onto the throne and flipping it over, sending a burst of dirt and shattered bone flying. A hidden dagger, coated in thick, glistening green venom, had been waiting there, Had he not moved, it would have skewered him in his sleep. But he didn't have time to be angry. The assassin moved again, a blur of black fur and flashing steel, striking from Skrat's blind spot. But Skrat was ready. He dropped his warblade and caught the assassin mid-air, his claws locking around the smaller Skaven's throat. The assassin let out a strangled squeal, his red eyes wide with shock. Skrat squeezed. Prick. The assassin's neck snapped, his body going limp. Skrat threw the corpse to the ground, panting, blood dripping down his arm from the dagger wound. He turned to his storm vermin guards, who had only now arrived. They stared at the dead assassin. Then at him. There was no loyalty in their eyes. Only calculation. They had seen how close it had been. They had seen that Skrat was mortal. Skrat snarled, and for the first time in his reign he felt fear. More nights in the dark? The next assassin came the following night. A clan rat with a rusted sword lunged at him from the food pits. Skrat cut him down with a single slash, splitting the rat's belly open and watching his guts spill into the dirt. Another came 2 days later, one of his own warlocks, who attempted to poison his drink. Skrat caught the sour scent of warpstone venom and forced the warlock to drink it instead, watching as the rat convulsed and foamed at the mouth before choking on his own blackened tongue. Then there were the traps. A tripwire across a tunnel entrance that would have triggered a warp lightning blast. A hidden pit of rusted spikes beneath his war throne. A plague-tainted blade buried in the furs of his bedding. Someone wanted him dead. And they were getting bolder. The warband splinters. Skrat stood before his remaining chieftains, his warblades dripping with fresh blood. Behind him, the corpse of a traitor lay twitching, his throat torn open by Skrat's claws. Skrat's red eyes burned with fury. Who puts this bounty price on my head?" he snarled, his tail lashing wildly. The chieftains said nothing. They avoided his gaze, their tails curling around their feet. Skrat's teeth ground together. One of them knew. Maybe all of them knew. But none would speak. Because they were waiting. Waiting for one more failure. Waiting for the next knife in the dark. Waiting for Skrat to fall. Skrat gripped his warblades tighter. He would not fall. Not to Skrat. Not to the bounty. Not to any of these spineless rats. They wanted him paranoid. They wanted him doubting. They wanted him weak. Then let them see. Let them see what happens when a cornered rat fights back. Skrat's red eyes gleamed as he turned away. The killings were not over. If they wanted war, they would have it. Chapter 12. The Fading Horde. The tunnels of Clan Vilefang were emptying. The chittering hordes that once filled the warren, screeching in bloodthirsty fervor, now grew quiet. Once, when Skrat walked the corridors, the Skaven would scurry out of his way, pressing their snouts to the filth-streaked floor in obedience. Now they avoided him. Now they vanished. His warband was deserting him, and someone had to pay. A gathering of corpses. Skrat stood atop a crude platform of bone and iron, his red eyes burning with fury, his claws clenching the hilts of his warblade so tightly that they trembled. Below him 12 Skaven knelt, their tails curled around their feet in terrified submission. Suspected traitors. Deserters. Rats that had been caught trying to flee the warren, hoping to escape before the warlord's inevitable fall. Skrat bared his yellowed fangs, his lips curled in a snarl. "Scary run from me? Flee like coward curse?" His voice crackled with rage, echoing off the damp stone walls of the chamber. The assembled horde watched in uneasy silence. They had come not because they were loyal, but because they feared missing the lesson Skrat was about to teach. Skrat paced in front of the prisoners, his warblades dragging scraping lines into the floor. "Who speaks the lies? Who?" he snapped, his tail lashing like a whip. The kneeling Skaven whimpered, their eyes wide with terror, but none spoke. They knew what was coming. Scrat snorted. "Good, good," he muttered, flexing his claws. "Then you all die. Die." His warblade flashed. The first Skaven's head hit the ground before his body even realized it had been severed. The corpse tumbled sideways, blood spraying from the jagged stump of its neck. The horde let out an uneasy chittering. Scrat smiled. One by one, he executed the others, moving with slow, deliberate purpose, making sure his warriors watched each kill. A storm vermin tried to run, screaming, but Scrat caught him by the tail and yanked him back, driving his warblade into the base of his spine. The Skaven spasmed, gurgling as his body seized up, his claws twitching violently before Scrat ripped the blade free, spilling his insides onto the floor. By the time the last traitor lay twitching in the dirt, Scrat stood among a pile of corpses, his fur slick with blood, his chest heaving with exertion. The horde watched, but they did not cheer. The exodus continues. That night, more Skaven fled. Scrat had hoped his display would terrify them into submission, but instead it had confirmed what they already feared. Their warlord was doomed. The desertions increased. Scrat's warlocks had already vanished, taking their precious warp machines with them. His clanrats melted away into the tunnels, seeking safer masters, easier lives. Even some of his storm vermin, his so-called elite warriors, had slipped away in the night, leaving their weapons behind. By the end of the week, Scrat's warband had shrunk by nearly half, and the whispers continued. Scratch is weak. His doomed. The Grey Seers do not favor him. His rivals wait to strike. Scrat knew who was spreading the lies. Skrat. That filthy, scheming wretch had been poisoning his horde against him, whispering in the dark, planting seeds of doubt that now blossomed into full betrayal. Scrat paced in his war chamber, his claws digging deep grooves into the stone. His own forces no longer trusted him. His allies had turned their backs, and his enemies were closing in. His breath came in ragged, snarling gasps. The Grey Seer's prophecy was coming true. Your trusted Trestids will gnaw-bite at your throat. But Scrat was not done. No, if his army abandoned him, if they thought he would die a coward's death, they would soon learn their mistake. Scrat would not flee. Scrat would not kneel. Scrat would drown them all in blood before he let them see him fall. The next move? As the exodus continued, Scrat gathered what remained of his loyalists, his strongest storm vermin, his most vicious chieftains, his last remaining packmasters and war beasts. A small warband now, but a deadly one. They would not sit idle, waiting for the dagger to strike. They would hunt the traitors first. And Skrat Fullfang's name was at the top of the list. Chapter 13. Clash in the Warrens. The air in the tunnels was wrong. Scrat felt it before he heard it, the way the shadows seemed thicker, the way the silence was too deep, the way the usual sounds of scratching claws and muttered scheming had faded into nothingness. Assassins were here. The Eshin strike. The first blade came from above. Scrat's ears flicked, his tail curled instinctively, just enough for him to dodge left as a razor-sharp dagger slashed through the air, missing his throat by inches. He snarled, rolling forward, warblades already drawn. Above him, 3 black-clad figures clung to the cavern walls, their glowing red eyes narrowed in precise, merciless calculation. Eshin. They had come for his bounty. The second assassin struck, leaping down in a blur of darkness, twin daggers flashing towards Scrat's ribs. Scrat moved on instinct, bringing up his warblade. Steel met steel in a shriek of sparks, the force of the impact driving Scrat back a step. But he did not fall. He twisted his grip, catching the assassin's blade between his own. Then with a brutal wrench he snapped the assassin's wrist. The Skaven let out a hissing screech, but before he could react, Scrat drove his second blade deep into his gut, twisting viciously. The assassin spasmed, his body convulsing as black blood spilled from his mouth. Scrat yanked his blade free, kicking the body aside. The remaining two assassins did not flinch. No fear, no hesitation. They simply moved. One vanished into the shadows, while the other threw a trio of poisoned throwing stars, aimed for Scrat's throat. He barely managed to twist away. One of the stars grazed his shoulder, cutting through his armor, the poison seeping into his bloodstream almost instantly. Pain flared through his arm. Warpstone venom. His limbs stiffened, his muscles twitching uncontrollably. But Scrat was a warlord, and warlords did not fall to cowards in the dark. The death of shadows. His storm vermin were finally reacting, forming a defensive perimeter, their halberds raised, but the Eshin killers moved like smoke, too fast, too unpredictable. One assassin appeared behind a storm vermin, his dagger sliding effortlessly through the gap in the armor at the base of the neck. The storm vermin choked, clutching at his throat as blood sprayed in gurgling streams before collapsing onto the stone floor. Another screeched in panic, swinging wildly with his halberd. A mistake. The assassin ducked under the swing, rolled forward, and drove his clawed fingers into the storm vermin's eye sockets. With a sharp twist, he ripped the rat's skull open, sending fragments of bone and brain splattering across the cavern walls. Scrat ignored the pain in his arm and charged forward, his war blade slicing toward the nearest assassin. The Eshin killer dodged, but not fast enough. Scrat's second blade arced upward, catching the assassin across the chest, a deep, ragged wound spilling blackened blood onto the stone. The assassin staggered, but he was not dead yet. With a final desperate motion, he leapt onto Scrat, claws aimed for his throat. But Scrat was waiting. With a bone-crunching snarl, he bit down on the assassin's throat, fangs sinking deep into fur and flesh. The Eshin warrior let out a choked squeal, writhing and struggling, but Scrat held firm, his fangs tearing through tendons, ripping through his windpipe. With one final savage jerk, Scrat ripped the assassin's throat out, spitting the shredded meat onto the ground. The body twitched once, then fell still. The last assassin hesitated. Scrat locked eyes with him, his muzzle still dripping with blood. And for the first time, the assassin hesitated. Then he vanished into the tunnels, fleeing into the darkness. The assault was over. Scrat stood victorious. But the damage was done. The fear spreads. Scrat's storm vermin dragged away the corpses, the surviving warriors watching their warlord with wide, uneasy eyes. He could see the doubt in them. They had seen him bleed. They had seen him poisoned. They had seen an Eshin assassin nearly take his throat. A strong warlord would not be hunted like prey. And Scrat was being hunted. His enemies had smelled blood in the water, and so had his allies. Scrat smiled. From the shadowed tunnels beyond, Scrat Fang watched. He had known the assassins would fail. Scrat was still too strong. But that was never the point. The attack had proven something. It had proven that Scrat was mortal, that he could be killed, that the bounty was real, and that meant more would come. Scrat's lips curled into a slow, cruel grin. He would not need to kill Scrat himself. He would simply let the knives keep coming, until one of them found his heart. Chapter 14. The Doomwheel Gambit. The air in the Rust-Tooth workshops was thick with the choking stench of burning metal, ozone, and raw warpstone. The tunnels echoed with the clank of gears, the hiss of steam vents, and the screeching laughter of Warlock engineers, who scurried between half-finished death machines like starving rats picking at a rotting corpse. And in the center of it all, standing on a raised platform of scrap iron and broken bones, was Warlord Skratt Spinescourge. His red eyes burned with frustration, his tail twitching in irritation as he stared down at Warlock engineer Ricket Sparksnout, the last surviving Warlock loyal to him. Or at least loyal enough to take his warpstone without running off. "Is finished, yes, yes," Scrat snarled, baring his jagged fangs. "You promised big death mana. Doomwheel to kill my enemies. Where?" Ricket twitched, his mechanical tail jerking erratically as he wrung his claws together. Yes, Warlord, almost done. Just a little problem." Scrap's ears flattened. "Problem?" he hissed. Ricket nodded furiously, his whiskers twitching. Yes, big problem. Small chance it will explode, kill all, but only, maybe, yes. Scrat's tail lashed. He grabbed Ricket by the throat, dragging the Warlock forward until their snouts nearly touched. Fix problem, or I test Doomwheel on you." Ricket squealed, claws scrabbling at Scrat's grip. Yes, we'll fix. Doomwheel will crush all who oppose mighty Scrat. Many enemies will die. Squeal. Scrat released him, shoving him back into the scrap pile. He turned, red eyes gleaming with cruel anticipation. He needed to remind them all, his warband, his enemies, the traitors lurking in the dark, why he was feared. And a Doomwheel would do just that. Unleashing the Doomwheel. 3 days later, the final creation was revealed. Scrat stood at the edge of a massive carved-out cavern. His remaining warriors gathered around him, watching as the great war machine was wheeled forward on rusted chains. The Doomwheel was monstrous. A massive, rotating death engine, its outer frame built from jagged steel, covered in scavenged armor plates from fallen Skaven, and torn metal from stolen Empire wagons. 3 enormous wheels, each lined with cruel, barbed spikes, groaned as they turned, hissing with warp energy. At its center, a pulsing warpstone reactor hummed with barely contained power, sending violent arcs of green lightning crackling between its coils. Warp lightning capacitors lined the Doomwheel's flanks, ready to spit death in every direction. It was ugly, unstable, and deadly. Perfect. Scrat's warriors trembled, their tails curling inward as the Doomwheel was activated for the first time. A sudden roar of energy shook the cavern, the machine jerking forward violently, its wheels carving deep gouges into the stone as it began to move. Warp lightning crackled outward, arcs of green electricity leaping toward the cavern walls, melting stone and sending chunks of rock crashing to the floor. The assembled Skaven chittered in awe, some stepping back in terror, others screeching in excitement. Scrat smiled. Yes, they feared him again. Now it was time to test it in battle. A demonstration of power. Later that night, in the lower tunnels, Scrat gathered his most loyal warriors for a demonstration. A group of captured traitors, former soldiers who had tried to flee Clan Vilefang, were dragged into the cavern, bound and whimpering. Look, yes, Scrat called out, addressing his gathered warband. See what happens to weak fleers, to cowards, to traitor rats. He turned to Ricket Sparksnout, who stood at the Doomwheel's controls, his claws hovering nervously over the activation lever. Run, Warlock, Scrat sneered. Show them power might of Warlord Skrats, Doomwheel. Ricket hesitated, then yanked the lever down. The Doomwheel roared to life, lurching forward in a blur of churning metal and hissing steam. The captive screamed. The first was crushed instantly, his body reduced to a twitching smear beneath the jagged wheels, his bones snapping like twigs. The second tried to flee, but the Doomwheel's warp lightning capacitors fired, sending a blinding green bolt of energy lancing through his chest, blowing a ragged hole through his torso. He collapsed, spasming, his lungs boiling out of his mouth. The third and fourth tried to run together, but it did not matter. The Doomwheel swerved, its blade spinning, and in a violent, gut-churning instant they were turned into a mist of shredded flesh and flying organs. The tunnels fell silent. Scrat stood tall, his chest heaving, his war blades crossed before him. His warriors watched the doom wheel, eyes wide, tails curled. They were terrified, and that was exactly what Scrat wanted. See, Warlord Skratt is strong, mighty," he roared. "All who doubt flee will be crushed, destroyed. The doom wheel rolls for my enemies, and none will stand." His warriors screeched in approval, tails thumping against the stone. But Scrat saw the looks in their eyes. They feared him. They feared the doom wheel. But they did not respect him, and fear alone would not keep them loyal forever. Scrat gritted his fangs, his claws tightening on his blades. He had won them back, for now. But the moment he faltered again, the moment the doom wheel failed, the moment his enemies struck, they would turn on him. And in the shadows, hidden in the crags of the tunnel walls, Naskrith Foulfang watched. His lips curled into a slow, cruel grin. Yes. Let Scrat have his big machine. Let him think it would save him. Because soon, Scrat would see. The doom wheel would be his undoing. Chapter 15. The False Prophet. The tunnels of Skavenblight had always been filled with whispers. Tonight, they were filled with prophecy. The chittering hordes of Clan Vilefang gathered in one of the great caverns, a vast underground hall where the most sacred, bloody, and treacherous meetings took place. But this was not a war council. This was a sermon, and the one who would speak was no mere Skaven. It was a grey seer, and he had come to condemn Warlord Skratt Spinescourge. The gathering of the horde. The cavern was packed with bodies, a writhing, chittering mass of rats, some scurrying onto rocky ledges, others climbing onto crude platforms made of old rotting timber to get a better view. At the center, standing atop a stone dais carved with blasphemous runes, was Greyseer Skreek Gnawtongue. His white-furred body was wrapped in tattered robes, marked with the sigils of the horned rat, his long, curling horns blackened from warpstone exposure. He clutched a twisted bone staff, its tip crackling with green lightning, his beady red eyes gleaming with divine madness. And below him, standing among the gathered warlords and chieftains, was Warlord Skratt. His clawed fingers flexed over his war blades, his tail twitching with tension. Something was wrong. The Grey Seer had called this gathering without warning, without request, without tribute. Grey Seers did not do things without purpose, and Scrat could feel the noose tightening. Naskrit's deception. Hidden among the crowd, watching with amusement, was Naskrith Fullfang. This was his plan. For weeks he had whispered to Skrept Gnawtongue, feeding him lies, stoking his paranoia, until the Grey Seer had become convinced that the horned rat itself demanded Skrept's destruction. It had taken bribes, threats, and careful words, but now the trap was set, and Scrap would not escape it. The denouncement. Grey Seer Skreek slammed his staff onto the stone, sending a burst of green fire into the air, casting twisting shadows across the cavern walls. The Skaven fell silent. Then the seer spoke. Hear me, children of the horned rat!" His voice was a shrill, grating screech, each word dripping with divine authority. The horde trembled. The seer's eyes locked onto Scrat, his lips curling. "The horned rat speaks to me, yes. A vision. A curse upon Clan Vilefang." A chorus of fearful chittering spread through the crowd. Scrat's fur bristled. No, this is bad. The seer raised his staff again, and the warpstone at its tip flared with unnatural light. "I see the truth. The horned rat scorns Warlord Skratt Spinescourge. He is doomed, cursed. A failure foul killing in the eyes of the Great One. The cavern erupted in panicked shrieks. Scrat snarled, baring his fangs. "Lies, lies, who speaks these things?" The seer ignored him. He turned to the warlords, the chieftains, the gathered Skaven. "The horned rat has sent omen signs," he declared. See how Scrat's war beasts died. See how his warlocks fled. See how his doom will, his pride teeters on the brink of failure. He is not chosen, he is forsaken. The horned rat turns his eyes away. Scrat's claws dug into his palms. He could see it now, the way his warriors looked at him, their eyes filled with unease, their tails curling in doubt. The seer's words were working. He was being unmade. He stepped forward, his muscles tensing, his breath coming in ragged snarls. "I have crushed my enemies. I have killed traitors. I am strong, mighty. The horned rat does not forsake me." The seer's eyes gleamed. "Then prove it." The crowd hushed, Skane drawing closer, their beady red eyes glinting with anticipation. Kill the traitor, here, in front of all. Show us the truth." Scrat froze. The trap had sprung. If he attacked the seer, he would be branded a heretic. If he hesitated, he would be seen as weak, and weakness was death. His red eyes darted across the gathered warlords, seeking an ally, someone who would stand with him. None moved. Even his storm vermin, his most trusted warriors, stood silent, their halberds still. Scrat's blood ran cold. They had already made their decision. The curse had taken root. He was alone. The moment of madness. Scrat's mind screamed. He had ruled through terror, through fear. But fear did not hold forever. And now he saw it, the truth in their eyes. They were waiting for him to fall, waiting for him to die. Something inside Scrat snapped. With a sudden, frenzied snarl, he lunged at the seer, warblades raised to carve the liar apart. But the seer was faster. With a gesture, a surge of warp lightning exploded from his staff, slamming into Scrat's chest, sending him hurtling backward. Scrat crashed into the stone floor, his vision exploding in white-hot agony, his fur singed and smoking. The cavern erupted in chaos. Some Skaven screamed, others cheered. And through the haze of pain, Scrat heard the final words that doomed him. "The horned rat has spoken," the seer screeched. "Warlord Skratt Spinescourge is forsaken. He will fall. His reign is over. Oh!" A great screeching roar filled the cavern as the gathered warbands howled their approval. Scrat staggered to his feet, but he could already see it in their eyes. They believed the seer's words, and now they would all turn on him. Scrat let out a ragged, animalistic growl. His death had just been declared, and now the horde would come to claim it. The shadows triumph. Hidden in the darkened corners of the cavern, Nascrit Foolfang smiled. The seer had done his work. Now all he had to do was watch as Scrat's empire collapsed around him. Scrat had fought warlocks, assassins, traitors, and killers, but he could not fight prophecy. And that, more than any blade, would end him. Chapter 16. Flee or Fight. The tunnels of Skavenblight had never been quiet. But tonight they felt different. The usual chittering, the constant scurrying of claws, the distant echoes of gnawing teeth. It was all muted. As if the warren itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable slaughter to begin. Skratt Spinescourge stood in his war chamber, his claws twitching over the hilts of his war blades, his tail lashing in frustration, rage, and something else. Doubt. He was surrounded, hunted, and forsaken. His war band was crumbling. His allies had abandoned him. His enemies were closing in, and now he had one choice left: flee or fight. The fracturing of the inner circle. Skrat's remaining warlords and chieftains stood in the chamber with him, their fur bristling, their tails curling inward, their eyes darting toward the exits like caged rats. Once they would have stood at his side without hesitation. Now they were afraid, but not of their enemies. They were afraid of being near him, afraid of dying alongside him. Scrat slammed a clawed fist onto the stone table before him, splintering the wood, sending crude battle maps flying. "You all scurry like frightened pups," he snarled, his red eyes burning with fury. "You think I am weak?" A tense silence. No one spoke. Then, finally, Chieftain Skrilk Gnawfang, a wiry, battle-scarred rat, stepped forward, his ears twitching, his tail flicking nervously. "Warlord," he said carefully, we do not say you are weak. Skrat's ears flattened. "Then why do you speak like cowards?" Skrilk hesitated. Then he said what no one else dared to say. "Because we are losing." The room fell silent. Even Scrat paused, his claws tightening. Skrilk's tail curled tightly behind him, his voice becoming sharper, more urgent. We are surrounded. The other clans plot, waiting to strike. The Grey Seers have turned against us. The Horde loses faith. Half of our warriors fled after the false prophet's words, and now we hear whispers of Naskrit, gathering many warriors. He took a step forward, emboldened. There is no victory here. Skrat's tail snapped forward like a whip, lashing across Skrilk's face, sending the chieftain stumbling backward. The others flinched. Skrat's snarl echoed through the chamber. "Coward! You dare say this to me? His claws flexed over the hilts of his war blades. "You think I will just lie down and let them take my domain?" Skrilk rubbed at the fresh wound across his snout, his body tense, trembling. But he did not back down. "If we stay, we all die," he growled. You know this. The warband fractures." A new voice hissed from the darkness. Maybe that is what the horned rat wants. The others turned sharply, their whiskers twitching. Packmaster Krizik, his bloated form hunched over, his beady eyes flicking toward Scrat, licked his fangs nervously. The Grey Seer's words. They were clear. Scrat froze. A chill crept up his spine. The others were listening. Even now some of them looked at Krizik with consideration. The Grey Seer had declared him forsaken. The Horde believed it. And his own warlords were beginning to believe it too. Skrat's claws tightened around his war blades. A choice of blood. Skrat looked around the chamber. These were the last of his inner circle. And already they doubted. Already they wavered. He had to decide. Flee. Or make an example. His breathing grew ragged, his muscles coiled like a spring. Then, without a word, he moved. He lunged at Skrilk, his warblade flashing in the dim torchlight. The chieftain barely had time to react. He raised his arm to block the strike, but Skrat's blade cut through flesh and bone like paper. Skrilk screamed, his severed hand hitting the ground with a wet slap. He staggered backward, but Scrat was already on him, his warblades ripping through his stomach, spilling his innards onto the stone floor. Skrilk collapsed, shrieking, clutching his spilling guts, his tail thrashing in agony. Scrat stomped down onto his chest, pinning him. He leaned in close, his voice a whisper filled with venom. "I am not done yet." Then he ripped Skrilk's throat out with his fangs. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Scrat turned, his muzzle dripping with blood, his warblade stained with the viscera of his former chieftain. His storm vermin shifted uneasily. Krizik looked away, his tail curled tightly against his side. They had all seen the choice Scrat had made. He would not flee. He would fight. And if they did not stand with him, they would die. The moment of truth. Scrat pointed one blood-stained warblade at the others. Who else doubts? He growled. None spoke. None dared. Scrat snorted. Then, prepare for war, he snarled. We make last stand. We show them. Warlord Skratt still strong, mighty. The remaining warlords hesitated, then, slowly, they nodded. Not because they believed, but because they knew they would not survive if they opposed him. And in the shadows, Nascrit Falfang listened. He smiled. Scrat had chosen to fight. Good. Let the warlord waste his final warriors in a glorious, bloody stand. Let him bleed. And when the time was right, Nascrit would finish what he started. Chapter 17. The Burning Horror. The air was damp, thick with the stench of mold, rot, and something far worse. Something alive. Something hungry. The trap is set. Scrat moved cautiously through the abandoned tunnels, his warblades drawn, his ears flicking at every tiny sound. His remaining storm vermin followed, their armor clinking softly, their tails curling tightly with unease. This passage had not been used in years, long since collapsed and left to the things that lived in the depths. But his scouts had reported movement here. A message had come, a supposed informant, a cowardly warlock engineer desperate to trade information for safety. He had claimed to have proof of the traitor behind Scrat's misfortunes, proof of who had poisoned the war beasts, who had sabotaged his alliances, who had set the Grey Seer against him. Proof of Nascrit. Scrat had not hesitated. If the information was true, then he would finally gut the scheming wretch. If it was false, then the warlock would die screaming for wasting his time. Either way, there would be blood. But as Scrat descended deeper, his instincts began to gnaw at him. The tunnel was too quiet. The air was too still. Something was wrong. And then the floor gave way beneath them, into the maw of the beast. Scrat had only a moment to react, his claws grasping desperately for anything solid as the ground beneath him collapsed. The tunnel crumbled, sending him and his warriors plunging into the darkness below. They landed hard, bones crunching, armor clattering against rock. Scrat rolled to his feet instantly, his war blades flashing as he scanned his surroundings. They were in a massive cavern, the walls slick with moisture and grime, the floor littered with the gnawed bones of countless creatures. A stench filled the air, so powerful that even Scrat, born to filth, felt his stomach turn. The ground trembled. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the darkness. Scrat's eyes narrowed. He had been led into a trap, and now something was coming. The burrowing horror revealed. From the shadows of the cavern, something shifted. A shape? Massive, grotesque, and wrong. Then it emerged. The burrowing horror. A colossal, bloated abomination of the Under-Empire. Its pale, leathery skin stretched tight over a body of muscle and tumors, its limbs twisted with unnatural growths. Its snout was elongated, lined with jagged, mismatched fangs, dripping thick ropes of mucus. Its eyes, small, beady black pits, reflected nothing but hunger. Worse were its claws. They were not normal claws. They were long, serrated bone blades, jagged and covered in the blood of 1,000 meals. It let out a sound, a hideous, wet, gurgling screech, like a dying rat mixed with the rumbling of a landslide. Then it charged. A battle in the dark. The first storm vermin never had a chance. The horror moved with terrifying speed, lunging forward, its jaws clamping around the warrior's torso. There was a sickening crunch as armor crumpled like paper, the storm vermin's limbs spasming wildly before the beast tore him in half, his entrails spilling onto the cavern floor in thick, wet ropes. Scrat reacted instantly. "Fight, fools!" he snarled, lunging forward with his war blades. His remaining warriors followed, their halberds glinting in the dim light as they rushed the monster. The cavern exploded into chaos. The burrowing horror thrashed wildly, its massive claws swiping through armor and flesh alike. Another storm vermin was impaled, his body lifted into the air, twitching as blood poured from his mouth, before the horror slammed him into the ground with a sickening squelch. Scrat dodged left, rolling beneath a swiping claw, his warblade flashing out, slicing deep into the horror's thick hide. Black, rancid blood spurted from the wound, but the horror did not slow. It whirled, its massive tail smashing into another storm vermin, sending him flying into the cavern wall, his bones shattering on impact. Scrat snarled. This thing was killing his warriors too quickly. He had to end it. Now, the killing blow. Scrat rushed forward, ignoring the cries of his dying warriors, ignoring the pain in his limbs, ignoring the screeches of the monster as it tore through his warband. He had one chance. The horror turned, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from his face. But Scrat rolled beneath it, slashing both warblades across its throat as he passed. The horror shrieked, black blood pouring from the fresh wounds, but still it did not fall. Scrat pivoted, kicking off a jagged rock, propelling himself onto the creature's back. His claws dug into its slimy hide, his warblades raised high. Then, with one final snarl, he drove both blades down, piercing the base of its skull, driving deep into its brain. The horror convulsed, letting out a final gurgling death screech before collapsing. The cavern shook as its massive body hit the floor. For a moment there was silence. Then Scrat staggered back, panting, his fur soaked in the horror's foul blood. He looked around. Only 2 of his storm vermin still stood. The rest were dead, crushed, torn apart, devoured. Scrat ground his teeth. Another loss. Another failure. And somewhere in the darkness, a pair of beady red eyes watched. The shadow's victory. Naskrit Folfang smiled. He had not needed to kill Scrat himself. The beast had done the work for him. Scrat was alive, but weakened, broken, humiliated. His warriors were dead, his forces dwindling, his enemies closing in. Naskrit could already see the end. Soon, Skratt Spinescourge would fall. And when he did, Naskrit would be there to take his place. Chapter 18. The Council's Decree. The deep warrens of the Under-Empire had witnessed countless betrayals. But tonight, something greater was happening. Something that had not happened in generations. The warlords were gathered, and they had come for Scrat. The gathering of warlords. In the depths of Skavenblight, in an ancient, crumbling ruin, the great Council of Warlords had convened. Not the Council of 13, no. This was something lesser, but still dangerous. A gathering of powerful Skaven warlords, leaders of nearby clans who had grown weary of Scrat's failures, of his losses, of his doom. They had come together to decide his fate. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with twisted roots, warpstone braziers flickering with eerie green light. The stench of death lingered here. The ghosts of past rulers, of warlords who had dared to stand above their station and had been dragged down into the dirt. And at the center of it all, upon a raised dais of scavenged metal and cracked stone, sat the ruling warlords. 6 of them, each powerful, each scheming, each watching, waiting, gnawing at the edges of power like starving rats. And tonight, They would feast upon Skrat's ruin. The speakers of doom. The first to speak was Warlord Skratt Splinterfang, his fur mangy, his armor stitched together from rusted plates and stolen trophies. He leaned forward, his yellowed fangs glinting in the sickly green light. Skratt Spinescourge, his time is over. Over. His voice was low, guttural, filled with the pleasure of tearing down a rival. The warlords chittered in agreement. Another spoke, Varlek the Bone Yar, a hulking brute with jagged scars crisscrossing his face. Is weak, lost many warriors, failed to hold his own warrens. Another snarl of agreement rippled through the chamber. The warlords were like wolves, circling a wounded animal, waiting for the moment to pounce. Only one sat silent. Skratt Spinescourge. He watched, his red eyes gleaming, his whiskers twitching, as the others did his work for him. He had no need to push them further. They had already made their decision, and when they stripped Scrat of his titles, when they declared him unfit to rule, Skrat would be ready to take his place. The formal condemnation. The oldest of the warlords, a wiry skeletal creature known as Greyfur Vretch, tapped his long, sharpened claws against the stone, calling for silence. The chittering stopped. Greyfur's eyes narrowed, his tail flicking behind him. The time has come, he rasped. Skratt Spinescourge is forsaken. The Grey Seers have spoken. The Horned Rat rejects him. Murmurs filled the chamber. Greyfur raised a single claw, and the whispers ceased. We strip Skratt Spinescourge of his titles. A final decree. A death sentence. Scrat was no longer a warlord. His forces were no longer his. His domain was free to be divided, conquered, taken by the strongest. The assembled warlords bared their fangs, tails flicking with hunger. The feast was ready, and Scrat would be the meal, the darkest smile. As the meeting ended, as the warlords left to prepare their warbands, to divide Skrat's empire like scavengers picking at a rotting corpse, Skrat Spinescourge remained still. He had not spoken. He had not needed to. Everything had fallen into place. Scrat was alone. His own kind had cast him out. His army was gone, his enemies closing in, his last supporters dwindling. He was finished. And yet Skrat was not done. He did not want Scrat to fade into the shadows, to disappear, to die in some filthy corner of the Under-Empire. No. He wanted to watch him break. To watch him fight and fail and fall. And when the time was right, when Scrat was nothing more than a desperate, cornered beast, then Skrat would strike the final blow. His grin widened. The end was near, and it would be glorious. Chapter 19. Skratt Spinescourge was not a fool. A lesser rat would have cowered, a weaker warlord would have fled. But Scrat was no lesser rat. He had ruled by strength, by cunning, by ripping out the throats of those who dared challenge him. And if the warlords of Skavenblight thought they could strip his power away like scraps from a dead thing's bones, then they would learn their mistake in blood. But he needed war machines. He needed weapons. He needed Clan Scryer. The journey to Scryer territory. Skrat's remaining warriors, his last battered storm vermin, the few chieftains who still feared him more than they feared the others, moved quickly through the tunnels, their weapons clutched tight in trembling claws. They were not what they once were. Scrat had once led a horde, a legion of skittering warriors, but now they were rats, scurrying through the dark, their eyes flicking over their shoulders, their tails curling at every echo. But Scrat did not look back. He only looked forward. Clan Scryer was his last chance. If the Warlock engineers could arm him, If they could provide doom rockets, warp lightning cannons, storm fiends, then he could tear down his enemies before they closed in. The warlocks were unpredictable, treacherous, arrogant, but they were business rats. And Scrat had a prize worth their attention. The offer. The cavern where Clan Scryer's engineers worked their madness was a place of chaos and death. Steam hissed from twisted pipes. Arcs of green energy crackled from unstable warp generators. The scent of ozone and burned fur filled the air. And at the heart of it, perched atop a throne of rusted metal and hissing machinery, was Warlock engineer Vrich Sparkfang. He was a thin, wiry thing, his fur half-singed, his left arm replaced with a sparking, erratic, mechanical limb that jerked unpredictably. His eyes were uneven, one a dull red, the other a warpstone lens that flickered violently. He stared at Scrat, his tail flicking, his mechanical claws clicking against his armrest. Scrat stepped forward, pulling a leather satchel from his belt, letting it hit the stone floor with a dull thud. The air hummed. The Skaven around the chamber stopped. They could feel it. Warpstone. Raw, unrefined, pure warpstone. Not the scraps that lesser warbands fought over. This was old, deep-core warpstone, the kind that drove rats mad just by touching it. The kind that Clan Scryer craved. Scrat grinned, baring his blood-stained fangs. Deal, yes. You make war machines and I give warpstone, yes. Vrich's whiskers twitched violently, his mechanical eye focusing, unfocusing. He reached forward with his mechanical claw, plucking up one of the jagged, pulsing green shards. He held it close, inhaling deeply. Scrat could see it, the way his claws trembled, the way his pupils dilated, the way his tail curled with greedy hunger. Yes. He had him. The Sabotage. The deal was nearly made. Vrich leaned forward, his fanged mouth twisting into a grin. Yes, war machines, much death. Kill your enemies. But before Scrat could clench victory in his claws, the cavern was suddenly filled with screaming. A Skaven burst through the entrance, his body covered in deep, wet gashes, his armor slick with blood. Betrayal! The dying Skaven shrieked. The room froze. Warlocks attack! Clan Scryer turns on Warlord. Then, before anyone could react, a shimmering blue blade erupted from his chest, splitting his ribcage open in a spray of thick, dark blood. The Skaven collapsed, twitching, the sound of gurgling death filling the chamber. And behind him, stepping out from the crimson haze, his own blade slick with fresh gore, was Skrat Falfang. Scrat's breath came in ragged snarls. No, this was not happening. Not now. Not when he was so close. Skrat grinned, his fangs gleaming. Warlord Skratt, he purred, stepping forward, his clawed fingers dripping with blood. Making secret deals, yes. Scrat's claws clenched. You trick-liar traitor. The room erupted into chaos. Scry warlocks shouted in confusion. Storm vermin drew their blades. Warp lightning crackled through the air. Vrich snarled, his tail whipping violently. You, bring Trick Warbin into my lair, he screeched at Scrat, his clawed hand jerking toward the nearest control panel. You died for this. It was over. The warlocks turned their weapons on Scrat's forces. The warp lightning cannons fired, sending bolts of screaming green energy through his warriors, their armor melting, their bodies exploding into twisted piles of charred flesh. The storm vermin broke ranks, screeching in panic, caught between the madness of Scryer's war machines and the grinning blade of Skrat Falfang. Scrat let out a roar of pure rage, slashing out wildly, his war blade cutting through the throat of the nearest Skaven. But he knew. He had lost. Again, his last chance at salvation had been turned to dust. His warriors were dying. The Scryer warlocks were against him, and Skrat had played him for a fool. Again, Scrat snarled, spitting blood, his eyes darting toward the nearest exit. He had one choice left: flee. He hated it. It boiled in his blood, burned in his gut, made his claws twitch with fury. But if he died here, then Skrat won, and Scrat would never let him have that victory. With a guttural snarl, Scrat turned and ran, leaping over bodies, dodging the screaming fire of warp lightning. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could already hear Skrat laughing. The traitor had won again. But Scrat would make him pay. Somehow, some way. He would kill him for this. Chapter 20. Skrat's Coup. The streets of Skavenblight were rarely silent. Even in the darkest tunnels, where the filth ran thick and the stench of rot clung to the air, there was always a whisper, a scurry, a screech of hunger or pain. But tonight the city was alive with something else. Revolution. And at the heart of it all, standing upon a platform of broken stone and rusted metal, basking in the glow of 100 beady red eyes, was Skrat Fullfang. His moment had come. Skratt Spinescourge was finished, and tonight he would take his throne. The betrayer's speech. A great horde had gathered in the Undercity central chamber, a massive cavernous warren where the most powerful warlords of Skavenblight often barked their decrees, tore down rivals, and declared war upon their kin. Hundreds, thousands of Skaven packed the tunnels, their tails twitching, their claws scratching against the stone as they waited. They could smell it, the blood in the air, the change in the wind. And Skrat stood at its center, his scarred snout curled in triumph, his eyes gleaming with victory. He raised a single claw, and the murmuring voices fell silent. Then he spoke. The condemnation of Scrat. Skaven of Skavenblight, hear, listenin'. The time has come. The traitor fool Skratt Spinescourge is finished, done. His army's gone. His dominion shattered. A chorus of screeches filled the chamber, tails whipping in approval. Skrat grinned. The horn rat has spoken. The grey seers have spoken. The warlords have decided. Scrat is not a warlord. No. He is a failure fallaty. A coward. More screeching, more stomping claws. It was so easy. They had already turned against Scratch. They had already abandoned him. All Skrat had to do was give them permission to tear him apart. He raised his arms wide, his tail flicking with false sorrow. Once Scrat was mighty strong, yes, but now he is weak, cursed. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he delivered the final blow. I declare, announce this. Skratt Spinescourge is no longer a warlord of the Under Empire. He is a rat without a warren, a fool without a name. He is prey. The horde roared in approval. It was done. Scrap had been erased. Now all that remained was to kill him. The hunt begins. The warrens erupted into chaos. Scrat's remaining followers scattered, some fleeing into the tunnels, others dragged into the streets, torn apart by their former kin. The streets of Skavenblight ran slick with blood, the air filled with the screams of the dying. And in the darkness, Scrat ran. He was alone now, his armor cracked, his warbays coated in the filth of the battle he had just lost. His storm vermin were dead. His chieftains had betrayed him. His last hope, Scryer, was gone. And now they were all hunting him. Skrat's warbands spread through the tunnels, sniffing, snarling, searching for the wounded warlord. Scrat gritted his fangs, his breath coming in ragged snarls as he leaped over a rotting wooden walkway, sliding down a tunnel filled with broken corpses and gnawed bones. He had ruled these tunnels once. Now he was just another rat, running for his life. He could hear them behind him, the scraping claws, the chittering voices, the scent of blood on the air. He had minutes, seconds before they caught up. His mind raced. Where could he go? Not to his old strongholds, they were already overrun. Not to the warlocks, they would kill him on sight. Not to the plague monks, they would feed him to their wretched diseases. There was only one place left. Scrat took a shuddering breath and turned toward the deepest, darkest tunnels of the Under-Empire, into the black, the places where even Skaven feared to tread, and the places where things older and hungrier than rats lurked, the places where gods did not watch. He disappeared into the blackness, his breath ragged, his mind spinning with rage and hate. Skrat had won this battle. Scrat was not dead, and as long as he still lived, there was still a war to be fought, a war he would make Skrat regret. Chapter 21. The Buried Blade. The tunnels were silent here. Not the usual silence of Skaven sneaking, whispering, plotting, but a deeper, older quiet. A silence that even rats feared to break. Skratt Spinescourge moved through the darkness, his claws gripping his warblades, his red eyes darting from shadow to shadow. His fur was matted with filth, his armor scratched and dented, his body marked with wounds from his flight through the Under-Empire. But he was alive, and as long as he lived, he would not be beaten. He had crawled deeper than any sane Skaven would go, fleeing into the black tunnels beneath Skavenblight, the forgotten places, where even the chittering horde did not tread. For days he had wandered, hiding, starving, waiting. He had lost everything. His warband, his power, his name. But he was not dead. And as long as he drew breath, he would find a way to take back what was his, even if it meant delving into the dark where no rat dared tread. The crumbling ruin. The tunnels here were ancient, walls slick with moisture, littered with the bones of long-dead creatures, their skeletons gnawed and half-buried in the dirt. The air stank of something old, something wrong. Warp energy still lingered in these halls, a faint hum that set Scrat's fur on edge. And then, at last, he saw it. A great collapsed chamber, its roof caved in, the stone walls covered in deep, Skaven-mad carvings. He recognized the markings immediately. This was a temple, or what remained of one. A shrine to war, to conquest, to the horned rats chosen. Once this place had been important, but now it was buried, forgotten, swallowed by time. Scrat stepped forward, his claws scraping against the cracked stone. He did not believe in fate, but something had drawn him here, and in the center of the ruins, half buried beneath the rubble, he saw it. The blade of the Forsaken, a weapon, a blade of warp silver, pulsing with sickly green veins of raw magic, is lodged deep in the cracked stone, as if waiting. Skretty's breath caught. The blade was huge, its edge serrated, uneven, jagged, with the brutal craftsmanship of old Skaven warsmiths. The hilt was wrapped in aged blackened leather, and the crossguard was carved with Skaven runes, symbols of power, of bloodshed, of dominance. This was not just a sword. This was a relic, a weapon of the Skaven warlords of old, a forgotten artifact of death. Something powerful, something worthy of a king. Scrat's claws trembled as he reached for it, his breath coming in ragged snarls. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, his mind was filled with fire. A surge of energy flooded his body, his vision blurring into sickly green light, his fur standing on end as raw warp magic coursed through his veins. Vision, memories. He saw Skaven warlords, long dead, their armies stretching across the Under-Empire, conquering, devouring. He saw his own future, Skrat's body lying broken at his feet, Skaven warlords kneeling before him, his enemies screaming as he carved their names from history. Scrat let out a choked, snarling gasp as he staggered back, his breath ragged. Then he looked down at the blade in his hands. It was his now, and he understood. This was not the end of Skratt Spinescourge. This was his rebirth, the first kill. A sound, skittering claws, a lurking shape in the darkness. Skrat's head snapped toward it, his new blade humming in his grip. From the shadows a Skaven scout emerged, his eyes wide with disbelief. A survivor from his old warband? A bounty hunter? A deserter? It did not matter. The rat saw him, and Scrat could not allow that. With a snarl he moved. The blade cut through the air, and the cavern was filled with a sickening, wet crunch as the warp silver edge cleaved through flesh, snapping bone like brittle wood. The scout didn't even have time to scream. His head was separated from his body in a spray of thick, dark blood. His corpse crumpled, twitching. Scrat stared at the kill, panting, his chest rising and falling with manic energy. The blade hummed in his grip, drinking in the blood, pulsing with something ancient, something eager. Yes, this was a sign. The horned rat had not forsaken him. No, no. The god had chosen him once again, and this time he would not fail. Scrat raised the blade, blood dripping from its jagged edge. A smile stretched across his face. He was coming back, and Skavenblight would drown in blood for what it had done to him. Chapter 22. Guerrilla Warfare. The tunnels of Skavenblight had never been safe. Even in the days of Skrat's rule, there had been whispers of things in the dark, of razor-thin blades slashing from unseen corners, of claws dragging Skaven into the abyss, never to be seen again. But now, the city was truly afraid, because Skratt Spinescourge had returned, and he had come for vengeance. The first kill. A lone Skaven chieftain scurried through a narrow tunnel, his tail twitching with paranoia, his beady red eyes darting left and right. This place had once been safe, a route used by Skrat's lieutenants to move between warrens without drawing attention. But now, nothing was safe. The tunnel felt wrong. Too quiet. Too empty. The chieftain paused, sniffing the air. His whiskers twitched. Something was off. Then the floor gave way beneath him. He let out a choked screech, his claws scrabbling at the loose stone, only to find himself impaled on a dozen rusted spikes, driven into the earth below. He gurgled, tail thrashing, as his lifeblood leaked onto the cold stone. Above him, a shadow moved. Scrat stepped into the dim light, his eyes glowing red, his new warp sword humming with dark energy. He crouched beside the dying chieftain, watching the life flicker out of his eyes. The Skaven tried to speak, to beg, to curse, to scream. Scrat didn't care. With a flick of his wrist, he drove his blade through the chieftain's throat, twisting it until the dying Skaven's body went still. Then he was gone, vanished into the tunnels before the blood had cooled. The Shadow War begins. The attacks started slow. Small skirmishes, isolated kills. A lone warlock found disemboweled in his laboratory, his own warp lightning coil jammed into his mouth. A clanrat courier dragged screaming into the sewers, his message found floating in a pool of his own blood. A group of Skrat's warriors walking through the lower tunnels, only to be met with sudden blinding light as a stolen doom rocket was fired straight into their ranks. The explosion tore them apart, flesh turned to ash, their armor melted to slag. Then the saboteurs began their work. Warpstone stores set alight, reduced to smoldering green craters. Weapon cache, stolen or destroyed, storm vermin left unarmed and vulnerable. Tunnels collapsed, escape routes cut off, hidden passages sealed forever. Scrat and his band of loyal killers moved like ghosts, striking fast, vanishing before Naskrit's forces could react. He was weak, his forces small, but that did not matter, because fear did not need an army. Fear needed only a blade in the dark. And Scrab was the blade. The bloody raid. One night, a war camp deep in Naskrit's domain erupted into chaos. It began with a whisper. A storm vermin on watch turned, thinking he saw movement in the dark. Nothing. Then a thud. He turned back, only to find his fellow guards slumped against the wall, his throat slit, blood pooling at his feet. He barely had time to scream before Scrat's blade punched through his spine, the warlord twisting it savagely, severing the rat's body in two. The camp erupted in shrieks. Scrat's killers struck hard and fast, ripping through the panicked soldiers, setting fire to the tents, slashing throats before the enemy even knew they were under attack. A warlock tried to unleash warp lightning, but before he could, Scrat's warp sword buried itself in his skull, the magic in the blade burning out his eyes before he collapsed, twitching. Another storm vermin tried to rally the troops, calling for reinforcements, only to find his head caved in by a stolen warp fire thrower, the weapon's stolen green flames reducing him to a shrieking, bubbling corpse. The camp was in ruins before Naskrit's reinforcements could arrive. By the time they did, all they found were corpses, burned-out weapons racks, and a single message carved into the stone. "I am not done." Naskrit's wrath. By the third week, Naskrit was furious. His lieutenants whispered of Scrat like a ghost. His warriors refused to patrol the tunnels alone. His own chieftains began questioning his control. He had hunted Scrat down, cast him out, stripped him of power. Yet somehow, the wretch refused to die. More than that, he was winning. Fear had crept into the ranks of Naskrit's forces. Doubt had taken root, and Naskrit knew he could not allow it to grow. He called a meeting of his warlords, standing before them, his claws digging into the stone, his fangs bared in rage. "No more," he snarled, his voice echoing through the chamber. No more attacks, no more shadows, no more ghosts. His claws flexed, and his storm vermin surrounded the room, their halberds raised. "I want Scrat found. I want his head on a pike. I want his hide flayed, his bones broken, his corpse crushed." The warlords nodded, terrified, tails curling beneath them. The hunt would begin again. Naskrit would send every killer, every assassin, every warlock in his employ to hunt down Scrat. And this time he would not let him escape. The war is not over. But deep in the tunnels, Scrat knew. He knew Naskrit would come. He knew the bounty on his head would grow. He knew the enemy would redouble their efforts to kill him. But he did not fear it. No, he welcomed it. The war had begun again. And this time, Scrat would not stop until Naskrit Foulfang was a corpse at his feet. Chapter 23, The Plague of Lies. The throne of Clan Vilefang was made of bone and metal, a crude, hulking thing, hammered together from the remains of fallen warlords. Naskrit Foulfang sat atop it, his claws drumming against the rusted armrests, his tail coiling and uncoiling in restless irritation. He had won. Scrap was dead. No, not dead, but broken. Exiled, scurrying like a wounded pup in the dark. Clan Vilefang was his now. The other warlords had acknowledged him. The banners had changed. The chittering masses of Skaven now bowed at his feet. He had everything. So why did he feel nothing but fear? Whispers in the dark. The first signs of treachery had begun as whispers. The same whispers he himself had once planted. Naskrit is weak. His warriors die to ghosts. The warlords doubt him. He cannot hold power. At first, Naskrit had ignored them. After all, whispers meant nothing. Then the disappearances began. A warlord who had sworn loyalty to him vanished, his private warren left in ruins, the walls slick with blood. One of his best warlock engineers found floating face down in a pool of toxic sludge, his mechanical arms still twitching with residual warp energy. A storm vermin captain, his body discovered in the tunnels, his throat slit so cleanly it looked like he had been butchered by a ghost. And worst of all, no one saw anything. Skrat knew this game because he had played it before. Someone was coming for him, and he did not know who. A war council of snakes. Skrat's remaining warlords gathered in the great chamber, their tails twitching, their eyes flicking toward one another, their claws resting just a little too close to their weapons. They did not trust him, and he did not trust them. But still they came to discuss the growing threat, the raids, the assassinations, the bloody marks of Skrat's return. A hulking chieftain, Vreka Bloodfang, snarled, "This is no war. This is mockery. Skaven do not fight like this." Another, Histrik the Pale, his thin, wiry body wrapped in darkened leather, let out a sharp chitter. Yet we die all the same." The others murmured in uneasy agreement. Skrat let out a low growl, slamming his claws under the stone table. "You all whimper sniffle like beaten pups," he spat. "Scrat is nothing, a scurry rat in the dark, a coward." His tail lashed. "We must hunt him, crush him, show all that we are still strong, mighty." A silence followed. Then Vreka Bloodfang leaned forward, his voice low. "Then why do the warlocks refuse you?" Skrat's ears twitched violently. What did you say?" Vreka's yellowed fangs glinted in the torchlight. "They say Sir William, perhaps he might doomed," he hissed. "They do not send their weapons anymore. They do not trade harmor their warp fire." He grinned, slow and sharp. "They do not think you will live long enough to use them." Skrat felt his claws dig into the stone. It was happening again. The same thing he had done to Scrat. The same slow, creeping betrayal. He looked around the chamber, at the faces of his warlords, at the way they did not meet his eyes, at the way they twitched, shifted, waited. They were testing him. They were waiting. For him to fail. For him to fall. Just like Scrat had. The execution. Skrat stood abruptly, his warblades hissing from their sheaths. The warlords flinched. He pointed at Vreka Bloodfang. You think I am weak? He snarled. Vreka's grin widened. "I think you are afraid? Skrat moved before the others could react. His warblade sliced clean through the air, severing Vreka's fingers as the warlord reached for his weapon. The hulking chieftain screeched, staggering back, clutching his bleeding stump. Then Skrat slammed him to the ground, driving his warblade into his throat, twisting until his rival's body convulsed, blood pooling beneath him. The chamber fell silent. Skrat panted, his claws slick with hot, wet gore. Then he turned to the others. "Anyone else?" The warlords shook their heads. Cowards. Weaklings. They had all considered betraying him. Now they would wait. Not because they were loyal, but because they were afraid. For now, the curse of the warlord. That night, Skrat sat alone in his war chamber, staring at the shadows flickering along the walls. He had won. He had killed his rivals. He had crushed Scrat. But still the whispers did not stop. Still, his warriors looked at him differently. Still, he could feel the knives pressing against his back, just waiting for him to fall. This is what it is to rule. This is what it is to be hunted. Skrat let out a low, chittering laugh, rubbing his face with his blood-stained claws. Scrat had been a fool, trying to rule through brutality and power. But now Skrat understood. The only way to rule the Under-Empire was to be more cunning, more ruthless, more treacherous than the rest. He had dug Skrat's grave with whispers and lies. Now he would not let the same happen to him. No, Skrat would survive. He would outmaneuver, outkill, outscheme them all. Because he was not Scrat. Scrat had fallen to treachery. But Skrat was treachery. Chapter 24. A Dangerous Alliance. The tunnels of the deep warrens were old, twisted things, forgotten places beneath even the scum-ridden underbelly of Skavenblight. No banners marked these tunnels. No chieftains sent patrols here. No sane Skaven came this deep, which was why Scrat was here. He needed an ally, and the warlock he sought was more dangerous than most. The outcast warlock. The stink of ozone clung to the air. Scrat's whiskers twitched as he stepped forward, the distant sound of hissing pipes and sparking warp energy growing louder. The chamber ahead was lit with flickering green light, its walls lined with rusted machinery, its floor littered with broken gears, shattered glass, and discarded bones. At the center of it all, hunched over a glowing contraption of twisted metal and sparking coils, was Warlock engineer Skratt Spinescourge. He was a wretched thing, even by Skaven standards, his fur half-burnt, his left arm replaced with a crude mechanical claw that twitched and sparked unpredictably. His eyes flickered with madness, one organic and twitching, the other a warped, oversized lens embedded deep into his skull. Scrat had heard of him before. Once, Skrat had been a rising star among Clan Scryer, an innovator, a warlock whose warped lightning creations had melted entire Skaven warbands in an instant. Then he had been betrayed. His own fellow engineers had turned on him, sabotaged his work, blamed him for a catastrophic weapons failure that had reduced an entire laboratory to bubbling sludge. They had declared him unworthy, cast him out like a diseased rat, and left him to die in the tunnels. But Scratchet did not die. He had survived, and he had spent years plotting revenge. The pact of revenge. Scrat stepped forward, his claws resting on the hilt of his new warp sword, his eyes locked on the warlock. Scratchet's ears flicked, but he did not look up. "Och, I hear ye, yes, yes," the warlock muttered, his voice a nervous, chittering rasp. "Sneak creep into my lair. Think you can steal from Skrakit?" Scrat's tail twitched. "I am no thief," he growled. At that, Skrakit finally turned, his warp lens focusing, unfocusing, clicking as it adjusted. He sniffed the air. Then his lip curled. "All right. Exile rat. Fallen failed warlord. Yes, I know. Know you. Skratt Spinescourge. Betrayed. Hunted. Now you skulk hide in the dark. Yes. Skrat's claws flexed over his blade, but he forced himself to remain calm. He needed Skrakit. For now. "I come to make a deal," he hissed. Scratchy snorted. "Ha, and what could a dead warlord offer me? Me?" Skrat grinned, slow and sharp. "Skrat." The warlock froze. His whiskers twitched. His mechanical hand clenched, metal scraping against metal. Skrat stepped closer, voice low, venomous. "I know what happened to you. I know how you were cast out, how your warlock kin betrayed you, just like Skrat did to me. Me." He leaned in, his eyes gleaming. "You want revenge. Revenge, yes. I do too." For a moment, Skrakit was silent. Then he let out a low, rasping laugh. "Ah, yes, revenge, yes. That is good. Skrat grinned wider. The trap had been set, and Skrakit had walked into it. the war machines of the doomed. For the next 3 days, Scrab watched as Skreket's twisted genius came to life. The Warlock worked without rest, his laboratory a madhouse of glowing coils, rattling gears, and sparking machinery. Crude doom rockets were assembled, their warpstone cores barely contained. Rusting warp fire throwers were refitted, their pipes modified to spray burning green death even further. Even a prototype rattling gun was recovered, though it was so unstable that even touching it risked detonation. Skreket's eyes gleamed with madness as he worked, his mechanical hand twitching with excitement. Yes, 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 war machines death hath, burn, burn, I will see them all, die squeal. Scrat watched. He had no love for warlocks, but this one was useful. And soon, very soon, Skrat would feel their wrath. The blood price. On the 4th night, as Scrat prepared to leave, Skrekket grabbed his wrist, claws biting into fur. Scrat's ears twitched, eyes narrowing. What? The Warlock's eyes gleamed, his warp lens pulsing with eerie green light. There is one price. Scrat's tail flicked. Speak, say. Scrathy grinned, wide and toothy. When the war is done, when we burn Skrat and his kin. His voice lowered, becoming a hungry whisper. You give me the corpse. Scrat's eyes gleamed. He did not ask why. He did not care why. He only grinned, and shook Skreket's hand. Done. The war resumes. As Scrat left the Warlock's lair, he could feel it, the turning of fate, the smell of death in the air. The war had begun anew, and this time he was not fighting alone. This time he had fire, lightning, and madness at his side, and Skrat would burn. Chapter 25. The Fall of the Rival. The tunnels of Skavenblight had long been filled with whispers of treachery, of betrayal, of power seized and stolen in the dark. But tonight there was only one name on every rat's tongue. Skratt Spinescourge. He had returned from exile. He had burned Skrat's camps, slaughtered his warlords, and reclaimed his lost dominion one tunnel at a time. And tonight he would end it. Tonight Skrat Fulfang would die. The trap is set. Skrat's warband moved through the tunnels, their armor slick with filth, their claws clutching rusted halberds and warp-fire weapons. Their breath came in ragged gasps, their tails twitching with unease. They had been lured here. The raids, the sabotage, the assassinations. Scrat had drawn them out, forced Skrat into a reckless march. And now the fool had walked straight into his claws. The tunnel suddenly opened into a vast chamber, a long-abandoned Skaven warren with high ledges of broken stone, rusted metal platforms, and collapsed bridges. A perfect killing ground. A death trap. The moment Skrat's warband set foot inside, the entrance collapsed behind them. A thunderous crash, a rain of debris, a choking cloud of dust. And from the darkness above, Skrat's warriors emerged. Doom rockets screeched from the high ground, exploding in violent green fire, consuming clan rats in an instant, reducing them to shrieking, smoldering husks. Rattling guns roared, spewing warp stone-laced bullets into the panicked horde, sending limbs and chunks of flesh spraying across the cavern. From the tunnels behind, warp fire throwers unleashed sheets of burning death, flooding the chamber with hissing, screaming rats, clawing at their own melting flesh. Skrat's eyes widened in horror. This was not a battle. This was slaughter. And Scrat had made sure he could not escape. The duel of warlords. Through the smoke and fire, through the dying shrieks of his warriors, Skrat saw him. Scrat stood upon a broken bridge, his warp sword humming with malevolent energy, his red eyes burning with triumph. He grinned, his jagged teeth gleaming in the glow of the burning battlefield. Look, traitor wretch, Scrat sneered. No allies now, no warlords to save you? Nuskrit's claws clenched, his blades. He had worked too hard, betrayed too many, killed too much to fall like this. If this was to be his end, then he would not die like a coward. With a feral snarl, he lunged forward. Scrat met him mid-air, their warblades clashing in an explosion of sparks and warp energy. They moved with the speed of killers, slashing, dodging, countering, lunging, a dance of death honed over years of Skaven warfare. Naskrit's blade carved a deep gash across Scrat's side, blood spraying against the stone. Scrat barely flinched. He twisted, his warp sword slamming into Naskrit's shoulder, searing through armor and flesh, warp fire hissing as it burned into bone. Naskrit screeched in agony, his tail lashing wildly. They broke apart, circling, panting, blood dripping from their wounds. The sounds of battle faded around them. Now there was only this, only the kill, the final blow. Naskrit lunged again, his blade aimed for Scrat's throat. A feint. Scrat saw it. He sidestepped, and before Naskrit could recover, Scrat's warp sword plunged into his stomach, deep, too deep. The blade hissed, the warp magic igniting inside Naskrit's body, burning him from the inside out. Nesk gasped, choking on his own blood, his claws weakly grasping at Scrat's arm. His legs buckled. His breath hitched. Scrat leaned in close, his whisper dripping with venom. Did you think you could take from me and live live? Naskrit let out a choking, rasping growl. Scrat will fall again, like before. Scrat grinned. Maybe, but not today. With a savage twist, Scrat ripped the blade upward, cleaving Naskrit in half from stomach to skull. His corpse crumpled, twitching, eyes wide in lifeless shock. Scrat stood above the body, his warp sword dripping with blackened blood, his breath ragged, victorious. It was over. The warband watches. The battlefield fell silent. Naskrit's surviving warriors stared, their tails curling inward, their ears flattened in fear. Scrat raised his blood-soaked blade, his voice echoing through the cavern. Naskrit is dead. His war is lost. The Skaven chittered, uncertain, fearful, hesitant. Then, one by one, they knelt, bowed, accepted the truth. Scrat was not dead. Scrat was not forsaken. Scrat was warlord once more, and Skavenblight belonged to him again. The shadows whisper again. As the bodies were cleared, as the flames died down, Scrat stood alone, staring down at Naskrit's corpse. He had won, but he had learned something from this war. Power was never permanent. Treachery was always waiting. And one day some other rat would do to him what he had done to Skritas. His clawed fingers tightened around the hilt of his warp sword. Not today, and not without a fight. The Under-Empire belonged to the strongest, and Scrat would make sure that was him. Forever. Chapter 26. Reclaiming the Horde. Skratt Spinescourge stood upon the corpse of his greatest enemy, his warp sword still dripping with Naskrit's steaming blood. His clan rats and storm vermin had gathered in the ruined war camp, their red eyes flickering between the shattered body of their former master and the warlord who now held his place. Fear, uncertainty, opportunity. These were the only truths of Skavenblight. Scrat had slain Naskrit, crushed his armies, and reclaimed his name, but he knew better than any rat that victory was only the beginning. Now he had to rule, and ruling was always harder than killing. The horde bows, for now. The skittering mass of warriors, once Neskrits, once Scrats before that, stood in silent, uneasy submission. No cheers, no cries of loyalty, just waiting, watching. Scrat knew what they were thinking. They had seen this before. A warlord rises, a warlord falls. Power changes hands like stolen meat, passed between claws slick with blood and treachery. Would Scrat hold his throne this time? Or would he fall just like Skrat had? Scrat's clawed fingers tightened around the hilt of his blade. He would show them. He raised his warp sword high, his voice echoing through the cavern. Skrat is dead, his cowards are dead, his war is over. The Skavens screeched, their tails lashing in nervous anticipation. I am Warlord again. I am strong, strong, Scrat snarled, his fangs bared, blood dripping from his fur. Serve, follow me, and I will lead to power, to victory, to slaughter. A pause. Then the first chieftain knelt. Then another. Then, one by one, the warband bent the knee. Fear was a powerful tool, and tonight they feared Scrat. For now, the new war begins. Hours later, deep in the war chambers of his reclaimed fortress, Scrat sat upon his throne of bone and rusted steel, his claws tapping against the armrests. His storm vermin stood guard, their halberds crossed before the entrance, their expressions unreadable beneath their helmets. Before him, his new war council gathered, a mix of his remaining loyalists and Skrat's surviving lieutenants. Each of them bowed their heads. Each of them pledged their loyalty. Each of them was lying. Scrat could smell it. The same plotting, the same whispering, the same waiting for weakness that had destroyed him before. They would test him. They would scheme against him, just as he had once schemed against those before him. And when they did, he would gut them for it. Treachery in the ranks. The first sign came within days. A shipment of stolen warpstone, gone, vanished before reaching the forges. A scout's body discovered in the tunnels, his throat slit before he could deliver his report. A whispered rumor that one of his chieftains had been seen in a secret meeting with an envoy of Clan Scryer. Scrat sat in his ward chamber, listening to the latest report, his claws flexing. He had barely reclaimed his throne, and already the daggers were sharpening. His warband was not united. It was fractured, broken, riddled with the same treachery that had doomed Skrat. He had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. Scrat let out a low, rumbling snarl, rising from his throne. He had let them betray him once before. This time, he would not be so blind. A message in blood? That night, 3 chieftains were dragged from their chambers, their screeches of protest silenced by armored storm vermin. They were brought before Scrat in the main hall, the warband gathering to watch. No explanation was given. None was needed. The first chieftain tried to plead for his life, claiming innocence, loyalty, obedience. Scrat slashed his throat open before he finished speaking, letting his body collapse in a twitching, gurgling heap. The second tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Scrat hurled his warp sword into his back, impaling him to the cavern wall like a pinned insect. The third, trembling, fell to his knees, bowing so low his snout touched the floor. Scrat stepped forward, gripping him by the skull. He leaned in close, whispering in his ear. No more whispers. Then, with one sharp twist, Scrat snapped his neck. The warband watched in silent terror. Scrat turned, his fur slick with fresh blood, his eyes glowing red in the torchlight. He did not need to speak. They understood. This was the way of the Under-Empire. Power belonged to the strong, and Scrat would never be weak again. The war never ends. As Scrat sat upon his throne once more, he knew this was only the beginning. His warband was his, for now. His chieftains feared him, for now. But in the Under-Empire there was no such thing as peace. There was only war. There was only the next challenger. And the next time they tried to take his throne, Scrat would be ready. Chapter 27. The Grey Seer's Wrath. The Under-Empire had many laws. Laws that were ignored, twisted, broken, rewritten with blood, but one rule remained absolute. Never defy the Grey Seers. Skratt Spinescourge had won his war. He had slaughtered his rival, reclaimed his hoard, and crushed the traitors who dared plot against him. But now, the true masters of Skavenblight had taken notice, and they were displeased. The arrival of death. The air grew thick with the stink of incense and burning warpstone. The clinrats in the tunnels hissed and scurried away, tails curling in fear. The storm vermin clutched their halberds tighter, their red eyes darting nervously toward the entrance of Skrat's war-chamber. Then, from the darkness of the tunnels, he came. Seer Vermis Fangskreek. He moved with unnatural grace, his robe swirling around his skeletal frame, his twisted staff of bone and warpstone crackling with raw magic. His horns were long and curled, his white fur dirtied by ritual markings, smeared with sacred filth. And his eyes, his beady red eyes, burned with divine hatred. Scrat gritted his fangs, his claws flexing over his warp sword. This was no mere rival. This was a servant of the horned rat himself, and Scrat would have to kill him. The Seer's decree. Vermis stood before Skrat's throne, his staff slamming against the stone with a crack of thunder. The air hummed with raw magic, the torches flickering wildly. The warband fell silent. Then the Seer spoke. Skratt Spinescourge, you have defied the horned rat? His voice was like rusted steel, a harsh, grating screech that echoed through the war chamber. Skrat's eyes narrowed. I have done what Skaven do, he growled. Killed my rivals, took my place. The Seer sneered, his tail twitching in disgust. You have made chaos, yes. You have made Skavenblight weak. You have made the Under-Empire tremble, shake with your fool war. Skrat's fur bristled. Nope, he had made it stronger. He had culled the weak. He had won. But the Grey Seers did not care for victory. They cared only for control. And Scrat had become too dangerous to be controlled. The Seer's lips curled, revealing jagged, yellowed fangs. You are no warlord. You are a curse upon Skavenkind. The chamber grew still. Scrap's clawed fingers tightened on his blade. Then the Seer raised his staff. The horned rat has judged you. You will die, Skratt Spines. The chamber exploded into violence. The battle for survival. The first bolt of warp lightning struck before Scrat could move. It ripped through the air, a shrieking, crackling lance of green fire, and Scrat barely twisted aside in time. The blast hit the storm vermin behind him, reducing two of them to smoldering husks, their armor liquefying, their bodies crumbling into bubbling flesh. Scrat rolled forward, warp sword raised, charging the Seer. But Vermis was fast. With a flick of his wrist, the staff spun, and the ground beneath Skrat's feet cracked apart. A burst of warp energy exploded outward, sending shards of stone and green flame tearing into Skrat's flesh. He hit the ground hard, his vision blurring from the impact. Then pain, searing, agonizing pain. His body convulsed as tendrils of warp energy wrapped around him, squeezing his limbs, dragging him toward the Seer. Vermis cackled, stepping forward, his eyes gleaming. Yes, I see it. You are weak, Scrat. The horned rat turns away. You will burn in warp flame. Scrat snarled, his teeth grinding together. Weak? No, not again. Never again. With a guttural roar, he forced himself to move, his muscles screaming as he ripped free of the spell, his warp sword flashing upward. The blade met resistance, then sliced clean through. A jagged stump of bone and fur hit the stone floor, twitching violently. The Seer howled in agony, his severed tail thrashing wildly. Scrat did not stop. He lunged, driving his warp sword deep into the seer's shoulder, pinning him against the stone wall. The seer gurgled, blood spilling from his lips, his claws grasping weakly at the blade. His eyes, once filled with divine certainty, flickered with something else. Fear. Scrat leaned in, his voice a ragged, snarling whisper. The horned rat does not choose cowards. Then, with a twist of his blade, he ripped the seer open from chest to belly, his organs spilling onto the floor in a steaming pile. The warband watched in stunned silence. The gray seer convulsed once, then went still. A war against the gods. Scrat ripped his blade free, the warp sword humming with stolen energy, his chest heaving with fury. He turned, staring at his warband, his storm vermin, his chieftains, his assassins. They had seen what happened. They had seen him slay a seer of the horned rat. They had seen him defy the gods themselves. And now they had to choose. He stepped forward, his voice sharp, commanding. Who stands with me? A pause. Then, one by one, the warband knelt. Not out of devotion, not out of faith, but out of fear. Scrat grinned, slow and sharp. The gray seers had sent a message, but Scrat had sent one back. He was not weak. He was not forsaken. And if the horned rat wanted him dead, then let the god come himself. Chapter 28. The doom wheel returns. The tunnels trembled. A low, grinding hum filled the air, an unnatural whine of twisting metal, crackling warp energy, and the telltale stench of burning ozone. Scrat knew that sound. His red eyes narrowed, his claws flexing over his warp sword. The doom wheel had returned. The very machine he had commissioned, the monstrous war genet he had built to crush his enemies, had been stolen, lost to the chaos of his downfall. And now it had been brought back to kill him. From the darkness of the tunnel ahead, its groaning wheels screeched against the stone, its bladed rims sparking as they scraped the walls. Then it emerged. The doom wheel was worse than he remembered. Warp lightning crackled from overloaded capacitors, spewing violent arcs of green fire into the air. The engine whined and shrieked, its outer plating covered in fresh spikes, its once makeshift armor now reinforced with jagged iron plates. At its core, the massive warpstone reactor pulsed with unnatural energy, twisting the air around it with barely contained madness. And at the helm, gripping the rusted controls with manic fervor, was a Warlock engineer, one of Naskrit's last, desperate loyalists, eyes wide with frantic determination. The doom wheel was here to finish the war. And Scrat would not run. The first charge. The doom wheel's capacitors whined as they reached full charge, the massive wheels jerking forward with a violent lurch. Scrat barely had a second to react before it was upon him. He dove aside, rolling across the uneven cavern floor as the war genin tore through his warriors, its bladed wheels splitting armor, crushing bone, reducing Skaven to shrieking piles of gore. A storm vermin tried to stop it, planting his halberd against the floor, bracing for impact. The doom wheel did not slow. It slammed into him at full speed, snapping his weapon in half, pulverizing his chest, sending a wave of shattered rib fragments and blackened blood across the chamber. The Warlock let out a shrieking laugh, twisting the controls to whip the doom wheel around for another pass. Scrat snarled, tail whipping in frustration. He had built this thing to terrify his enemies. Now it had been turned against him. Fine, let it come. Let it try. A deadly game. The doom wheel screamed forward again, its warp lightning discharging wildly, bolts of raw energy blasting apart the stone floor, sending cracks spiderwebbing through the chamber. Scrat ran toward it, dodging left then right, avoiding the chaotic bolts as they seared past him. Another storm vermin lunged with a warp fire thrower, letting loose a blast of green flame. The doom wheel took the hit head-on, but its reinforced plating absorbed the fire, its warp reactor humming as if feeding off the energy. Then, in one sudden motion, it turned, blades spinning, wheels grinding, and the Warlock slammed a control lever forward. A hidden spear-like mechanism shot out from its front, impaling the warp fire thrower, lifting him into the air before tearing his body in half. His burning entrails splattered across the cavern floor, the air thick with the stench of charred fur and blood. Scrat gritted his fangs. This thing was unstoppable, unless he stopped it himself. The leap of death. As the doom wheel wheeled around for another charge, Scrat saw his only chance. There was one weak spot. The Warlock at the helm. If Scrat could get close enough, he ran straight toward the doom wheel. His warriors screeched in shock, scurrying back, but Scrat did not slow. The Warlock sneered, seeing his enemy running straight into death. "You die, fool rat." He slammed the power lever forward. The doom wheel surged ahead, engines screaming, bladed wheels grinding against the stone, sparks flying as it reached top speed. Scrat waited. At the last possible moment he leapt, high, higher than any Skaven should. His warp sword gleamed in the sickly green light. The Warlock's eyes went wide. Scrat landed on the spinning frame of the doom wheel, claws digging into the rusted plating, his warp sword carving deep gouges into the metal. The machine lurched violently, the Warlock screeching in panic, yanking the controls wildly to shake him off. But Scrat held on. His tail snapped forward, wrapping around a loose pipe for balance as he climbed higher, one claw grasping the back of the Warlock's skull. "You die now," Scrat growled. Then he drove his war sword through the Warlock's spine, ripping it out through his chest. The Warlock let out a choked gurgle, his fingers spasming, his body jerking wildly. And his claws yanked the control lever all the way forward. The doom wheel went berserk. The final crash. With no one at the helm, the doom wheel careened wildly, its warp reactor overloading, sparks and green fire erupting from its inner mechanisms. Scrat jumped free, rolling across the stone floor as the rampaging machine plowed straight into a crumbling wall. For a moment the cavern was still. Boom. A detonation of warp energy erupted outward, sending a shockwave through the tunnels, vaporizing half the cavern, sending chunks of molten stone flying in all directions. Scrat shielded his face, feeling the heat of the explosion sear his fur, the force of the blast nearly lifting him from his feet. When the smoke cleared, the doom wheel was gone. Only a twisted, burning wreck remained. Scrat let out a breath, his warp sword dripping with the Warlock's blood. It was done. The last of Naskrit's weapons had been destroyed. The final thread had fallen. Now, at last, Skavenblight was his. For now, because Scrat knew better than anyone. In the Under Empire, victory never lasted forever. Chapter 29. The Horned Rat's Judgment. The Under Empire had always been a place of treachery, of war, of bloodshed. Skaven lived by violence. Skaven died by violence. But there was one force above all that decided their fate. The Horned Rat. And tonight, the god had come to judge Skratt Spinescourge. The omens begin. The skies above Skavenblight churned with green lightning, the foul, polluted air thick with the scent of burning warpstone. Deep within his war chamber, Scrat paced, his claws scraping against the cold, damp stone, his mind racing. He had won. The doom wheel was destroyed. Neskrit was dead. His war band had submitted, out of fear if nothing else. But now the whispers had begun. His chieftains spoke in hushed voices, their tails curling with unease. The grey seers had vanished from his court, refusing to acknowledge him. And the Skaven of his warren, his own warband, avoided his gaze. Something was coming. Something worse than assassins, worse than warlocks, worse than rival warlords. The horned rat was watching, and Scrat did not know if he was pleased. The sacred vision. That night, Scrat dreamed. It was no ordinary dream. It was a vision, a prophecy carved into the rotting marrow of the Under-Empire itself. He found himself standing alone in the ruins of Skavenblight, the once teeming city reduced to silent ash, the tunnels broken, shattered, filled with corpses. His own warband lay dead, their bodies rotting, twisted, bloated with disease. And at the center of the carnage, towering over him, was a figure. A colossal rat, wreathed in warp energy, its eyes burning with an unnatural green glow, its claws long and jagged like barbed spears. The horned rat. Scrat felt his breath catch, his claws trembling despite himself. The god rarely appeared to mortal Skaven. When he did, it was either to bless or to destroy. The horned rat spoke, its voice a horrible screech, filled with malice and hunger. Scrie, you think you are mighty, strong, that you are chosen. Scrat fell to his knees, his tail curling beneath him. Yes, I have crushed, killed my foes, taken my place, proved my strength. The god chittered, low and dangerous. Yes, you have fought, killed, taken, but you are not yet worthy. Scrat's ears flattened. Not worthy? I have ruled, I have. The horned rat moved, and in an instant Scrat's body was seized by unseen forces, his limbs pulled taut, his bones creaking under the pressure. He screamed as warp energy flooded his veins, burning through his flesh, his vision swimming with darkness and pain. The god's voice was everywhere, surrounding him, inside him. Then prove it. The trial of blood. Scrat awoke with a scream, his body drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged. But he was not in his war chamber. He was in a cavern of black stone, its walls slick with filth, its air thick with the scent of blood and rot. He was not alone. Before him stood three monstrous figures, their bodies twisted by warp energy, their forms barely Skaven anymore. The trials had begun, and if Scrat failed, he would be torn apart, mind, body, and soul. The first foe, the executioner. The first creature stepped forward. It was huge, a storm vermin bloated with unnatural muscle, its flesh scarred with ritualistic runes, its war blades the size of cleavers. Its eyes burned with the horned rat's fury. It charged. Scrat barely had time to move, rolling beneath its first brutal swing, the blade carving deep into the stone floor where he had just been standing. He lashed out, his warp sword cutting deep into the beast's leg, black blood gushing from the wound. But it did not slow. It whirled, its massive fist slamming into Scrat's ribs, sending him hurtling across the cavern, crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through his body. His vision swam. He could barely move. The executioner loomed over him, raising its warblade for the final strike. But Scrat was not done. With a snarling burst of energy, he lunged forward, his warp sword piercing straight through the creature's gut. He twisted. The beast let out a gurgling screech, then collapsed, its insides spilling onto the floor. One down. The second foe, the lurker. The second creature emerged from the shadows, moving low and fast, its form flickering between existence and nothingness. A creature of the dark, an assassin that had never failed to kill. It struck without a sound. Scrat barely dodged, but not fast enough. Its poisoned dagger slid across his shoulder, the blade burning as warp twins seeped into his bloodstream. His limbs grew sluggish. His breath came in short, pained gasps. The lurker moved again, a blur of motion, its next strike aimed for his throat. Scrat dropped low, spinning his warp sword in a desperate arc. The blade met flesh. The lurker let out a strangled hiss, its head separating from its body, its lifeless corpse twitching before crumpling. 2 down. The final foe, the horned rat's will. The last figure was different. It did not attack. It merely stood, watching, waiting. Scrat stared at it. The thing's eyes glowed, its form constantly shifting, warping, writhing. Then it spoke. "Do you still think yourself worthy?" Scrat raised his warp sword, panting. "Yes." The figure laughed. Then it vanished, and the cavern crumbled into darkness. The horned rat's verdict. Scrat awoke once more, this time in his throne room. His warriors stared at him in fear. His body was untouched, but his mind burned with what had happened. The horned rat had tested him, and he had let him live. Scrat's lips curled into a slow, sharp grin. He had survived the judgment. He had proven his strength. And now he would show the Under-Empire why. Skratt Spinescourge still ruled, and he would rule forever. Chapter 30. The Eternal Cycle. The tunnels of Skavenblight were never silent for long. Even in the aftermath of war, betrayal, and the favor or fury of the horned rat, there was always a whisper, a scurry, a claw scraping against stone. For this was the way of the Under-Empire. There were no true kings here, no lasting empires, no warlords who ruled forever. There was only power and the constant, inevitable struggle to keep it. And somewhere, in the shadows of the throne room, another pair of red, beady eyes watched. Waiting for Skratt Spinescourge to fall. The throne of treachery. Scrat sat upon his throne, his claws drumming against the rusted metal armrest, his warp sword resting across his lap. The stale air of Skavenblight burned in his lungs, filled with the scent of filth, blood, and warp magic. His warriors knelt before him. His storm vermin stood at attention. His chieftains chittered and bowed in forced obedience. He had survived. He had won. The Grey Seers had judged him and allowed him to live. His rivals had died beneath his claws. He had earned his throne once more. And yet, Scrat could feel it already. The weight of power, the weight of ruling, the weight of knowing they all wanted him dead. This was not peace. It was simply a pause before the next betrayal. His warlords smiled too easily. His storm vermin stood too still. His chieftains nodded too quickly. He had been here before. They were waiting for him to stumble, to weaken, to falter. Waiting for him to become Skrat. Waiting for their turn. The next betrayer. In the shadows of the war chamber, one rat watched more closely than the others. His name did not matter. Not yet. For now he was just another chieftain, another Skaven eager to prove himself, another rat waiting for his moment. He had been loyal to Scrat. He had fought for him, killed for him, pledged his tail and blade to him. But loyalty in the Under-Empire was a lie. And this rat had been watching, learning, waiting. Scrat had proven his strength. He had survived assassins, warlocks, doom wheels, even the will of the horned rat himself. But even Scrat would not rule forever. One day he would grow too bold, too blind, too arrogant. One day he would become what he had once killed. One day he would make a mistake. And when that day came, when Scrat turned his back for just a second too long, he would strike. Because that was the way of Skaven, the way of power, the way of the eternal cycle, the final truth. The war would never end. His scheming would never stop. Scrat had taken his throne once more, but he was already living on borrowed time. He would kill, rule, and fight to keep his power until, one day, he lost. And when he did, the next Skratt Spinescourge would rise, and the Under-Empire would chitter and squabble and slaughter once again, as it always had, as it always would, forever. And